Okay, so just a few disclaimers before we officially begin, to remind you that this is not a private conversation, and will ultimately be made available to the public. I hope very much that this is a fun experience, and if at any time we start going down a line of conversation that is uncomfortable, just let me know. We can redirect.
Speaking of comfort, do you have a pillow I could put in my back? This chair is too big for me.
Yeah,
If there is one. Otherwise, I can adjust, but it'd be nice if there was something. This is made for large people.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as the couch, which I kept slipping off. Yeah.
And if you need to take a break at all during the interview, just let me know.
If I do, it's to clear my sinuses or something,
Okay.
unfortunately.
And then the last thing is, as you know very well, having had a lot of experience with interviewing, that my role is to talk as little as possible. But I am absolutely in tune and listening, and occasionally looking at my notes. And
Sure.
so we'll wait till see if
Yeah.
Ian finds.
I didn't look too
Oh,
hard at the
cushion.
the list of questions, but you just throw them at me. And
Yeah, and they're very open-ended, so we'll just start.
also,
with
I
them.
tend to talk too much, so just stop me if I want. If you're running out of time or something on it. If
Oh,
you'd rather I go to another subject, that's fine.
Okay, but we have as much time as you have, I think.
Okay. My husband and I have very different communication skills. It drives him crazy.
Let me advise you before documentary. We don't have a pillow, but I have
Oh.
a rolled up cardigan.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
And
that
it's-
might be helpful.
But it's the best I can do.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
There you go.
The chair is a little bit large for me. Oh, yeah, that's nice. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, so today is Thursday, June the 9th, 2016. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Barbara Joye here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And before we get into the actual interview, if I can just get your verbal confirmation that you're aware that this is being recorded. Okay, if you can describe a little bit of when and where you were born.
New Haven, Connecticut, 1942, August 21st.
And your family's background?
Oh, let's see. From the Bronx, they moved to Manhattan when my father finally got released from the Army after the war. He was kept late because he was a psychiatrist and he was treating people with what they used to call shell shock. So I ended up in an extremely privileged situation. I'm sorry, is this part of the interview or just data?
Yeah, no, we would like to know a little bit of your family background.
Okay,
so
fine.
Who your parents were,
Okay,
how they
fine.
met, how they...
Oh, well, they met in the Bronx as teenagers, but more to the point, I grew up in a left-wing Jewish professional family that was quite successful after the war because my father became a Freudian psychoanalyst, which was very trendy. So we lived on Park Avenue. But I was, for most of my growing up, but I was quite aware that that was luck and not that I deserved it for any more than anybody else would. And a few blocks away, there were people in very different circumstances. But another reason I had that, I think that I had that consciousness and those values is that my father had been in the Communist Party for 2 years in the 30s, 36 to 38. My mother was a little too cynical to join, but that was who they were. And that was because of the Spanish Civil War, the Depression, and the fact that my father's father was a real bastard. Didn't want to bring up his kids when his wife died in childbirth, giving birth to my father's younger brother. So my father was sent to be brought up by his grandmother, a Russian-speaking and Yiddish-speaking illiterate woman in the Bronx who was actually, my mother felt the brains behind the family business, which was, no, she was something, which was scrap iron, from the proverbial push cart to a small factory in the Bronx. It was a small, it was not a big enterprise, but they were better off than most people. And the grandmother started the first daycare center in the Bronx for working women. But, so that's how my father grew up, without much attention from his father. So he became a communist. And then my parents went to Europe for their honeymoon in '38, and among other places, which fortunately included Paris and that sort of thing, they went to the Soviet, and Germany, which was like in the movie Cabaret, really bummer. They didn't realize how bad it was. My mother said, well, we didn't trust the mainstream media. They didn't realize how bad things were in Europe. They then took a train to the Soviet Union, where my father was just so excited to be going there, and spoke fluent Russian, by the way, because his grandmother always spoke Russian when she didn't want him to know what she was saying to her friends and sisters. So they crossed over, and my father's going, comrades, I'm an American comrade, and they were going, shut up and open your luggage, and they were going through all this stuff. Anyway, there was a series of disillusionments, which I could go into in more detail, but it's not about him. And they found out what was going on. It was the worst time, possibly, to visit the Soviet Union right in the middle of the purge trials. Everybody was totally freaked out and paranoid, including his relatives who couldn't meet with him in public. So when they came back to the United States, he left the party, of course, and but my parents didn't go right-wing. They became Adlai Stevenson Democrats. So I grew up in the McCarthy era. I was born in '42, and pretty soon my parents and their friends and everybody I was in school with and everybody we knew was, feeling beleaguered and under potential attack. Not just the people who'd been communists, of course. It was, liberals and anybody. Jews. The Roosevelts. I'm sorry, the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were assassinated. Were murdered by the state in '51. Was that? Anyway, the Army McCarthy hearings. We got a television to watch them, and I didn't really understand this too much until I read Mad Magazine, which had a wonderful satirical piece about the Army McCarthy hearings. But I went first to Hunter College Elementary School, which was you had to take a test to get in. It was a school for gifted kids that was used as a lab for the education majors at Hunter College, which was also my mother's alma mater, coincidentally. The district that you could apply from stopped at 96th Street, which, if you know about Manhattan, is where Harlem starts. The subway comes up out of the ground. There were no black kids in my school. I didn't think about that till much later. But it really hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized how, gerrymandered the school district was. But, so there I was with a lot of other weird kids, which was okay. And then I transferred to the Fieldston School for junior high and high school. That's, it started out as the Working Man's School in the late 90s. The Ethical Culture Society, which runs it, was started by mostly Jews who wanted a religion that didn't get all involved in theology and God, stuff like that, but focused on how people treat each other. We had ethics classes. But by the time I went, it was mostly just a very good private school. Very privileged again. Mostly Jews, not entirely. Because the Catholics went to Catholic school, the WASPs went to fancy private schools elsewhere, mostly. And there were about a few black people, not very many. So Fieldston was wonderful, though. And then I went to Vassar. And when I went to Vassar, I was already looking for some political activity and was disappointed. So I started an SDS chapter, not really knowing what I was doing, but in the spring of, the first thing that happened, though, was in the spring of 1960, the student sit-ins took place in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the 4 black students at Vassar, 4, organized us, about 100 of us, to picket downtown the Woolworths in downtown Poughkeepsie. So that was what really galvanized me. For the first time in my life, I felt there was a chance to have an impact by something I could do. And that was when I decided a few weeks later, I went to a civil rights meeting for Northern students in support of the sit-ins at Wesleyan University, and I met the man who I later married, my first husband, Harlan Joye. So through him, I met Michael Harrington. He was working with Bayard Rustin at the time in something called the Committee to Defend Martin Luther King, who was being audited and harassed. So I was introduced to socialism, democratic socialism. He was in the Young Socialist League for a while. And I don't think he was in YPSL. I'm not sure. I went to a YPSL meeting with him, I believe. So things happened real fast after that. It was the 60s. I went to graduate school at Yale for a year, got my master's degree, transferred to Columbia because I wanted to move back to Manhattan and get married and live with Harlan on the Lower East Side, which we did. And after a couple years at Columbia, I taught for a year at Borough Manhattan Community College, English. I was an English major. I started out being a medievalist, and after I was sort of working my way up through the Renaissance at Yale, and then I was going to go to the 18th century. I mean, I was really crazy, and work my way up to the modern era. And finally I decided, screw that, and I just sort of skipped and realized I was much more interested in what was going on around me and its roots than I was in the more esoteric topics that had interested me as a student. Oh, I had majored in classics. So, I was going medieval and the Renaissance. Crazy. So, Harlan decided he wanted to do his dissertation on Southern whites like himself who had been in the civil rights movement. He was in the civil rights movement. And though not in the South, but in New York, helped organize the youth marches for integrated schools in '59 and '60, worked with Harry Belafonte on some things and so on. I never got to meet Harry Belafonte. But, so we came to Atlanta, so he could spend a year or two doing a bunch of interviews with Southern whites like himself, Southern Student Organizing Committee members, for example, and SDS members who were in the South. And I got a job at Atlanta University teaching English, where I stayed for a couple of years. Culture shock, had no idea what the history of the black schools were, didn't really understand it totally until I read, Levering Lewis's biography of Du Bois, and began to understand a little more about the background. So in Atlanta, I became involved with the Bird after 2 years of teaching at the black colleges, at the black graduate school, I should say. I dropped out, felt a little bit like I was in the wrong place. The Black Power movement was starting to have some influence, black identity. I got along very well at Atlanta University with the students and the other professors, despite my naivety in many ways. But I just wanted to take off for a while and teach part-time, which I did for a bit at, I forget what it was called back then. It's now Georgia Perimeter, I think. It was Atlanta Junior College and at Georgia State. And in '68, of course, the Bird got off the ground, and it happened to be close to where we were living. And I knew a lot of the people from our social life with the civil rights people and the peace people and what radicals there were in Atlanta at the time, all of whom tended to go to all the same parties and hang out together. There weren't that many of them. We weren't fragmented yet at that point. And in fact, the first year I was here, we hung out with the SNCC people and the black people, and before all that kind of separated. So, let me see. I've kind of led off from my background, my personal background, my family, but we could go back to that if you have questions.
Yeah, if I can get a couple points of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
If you could just identify your parents by their names.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Martin Jerome Gerson of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, the Church of Freud, and my mother was Helen Gerson. She didn't work until after I went to college, though she had worked a little bit during the Depression.
And you mentioned that your mom was an alum of Hunter College. What was her educational background, and as well as your father's?
Well, she majored in physics because she wanted to have that in common with my father, but she really should have majored in something else. And, that's what people did, I guess. My father got a prize for being the top physics student at NYU, but then he was really pre-med and went on to medical school, NYU Medical School, and that was a good thing. One of his close friends was called up before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but that guy had gone to a different medical school, so he named names from his unit of the Communist Party and not my father's. But during the McCarthy era, it was touch and go. I didn't know. I should mention something very important. I did not know that my father was in the Communist Party until after he died in 1969. You see, people didn't tell their kids stuff. They didn't want them to blurt out to the wrong people during the McCarthy era. If you didn't already know. I mean, I was not a red diaper baby in the sense that I did not grow up in a Communist Party environment, although some of my father's friends had been in the party. They weren't anymore, because he had pretty much broken with that crowd, at least the ones who stayed in. So that was pretty much their background. I was born in New Haven because my father was I think a resident at the time at the mental hospital in Newton, Connecticut. So, but we were always from New York City.
And just out of curiosity, what sort of branch of Freudian psychoanalysis did he?
The branch, the New York Psychoanalytic Association, was founded by followers of Freud, and I guess Anna Freud. He was not in one of the other groups. Yeah. But we found out, my mother told me, she found out after he died from his patients that he was pretty flexible and not dogmatic, and he was very, very popular. I even met one of the patients later on and by accident at a high school reunion and found out that he was much beloved.
And what was your mother's background?
Well, my father's, I mentioned the factory and everything, and not liking his relatives much. Excuse me. In the Bronx. My mother's father was a professional pianist. His father and his brothers, his father had come from Austria, was a musician and composer, though I could never locate any of his compositions. And he and his brothers were musicians and played in classical orchestras and jazz groups and had a booking agency and helped start the union in New York, the local of the musicians union. They were much more my father's kind of people. Mm-hmm. So he tended to bond with my mother's family and helped support her parents, and especially her mother, after my grandfather died, my maternal grandfather died. I met my grandfather on my father's side a few times, but he was not a pleasant person and we didn't hang out with him. My father's young brother, my father had two younger brothers, one of whom was kind of a troubled guy who we didn't have too much to do with, was brought up by his stepmother and his father, but my father's brother, who was born when their mother died in childbirth, was adopted and didn't know who his real parents were for a while, but eventually, through a series of events, found my father. My father found him, and they got to be very close as adults. He was similar to my father in some ways. He was an atheist. He was interested in music and art, and was a kind of a left liberal, but grew up in the Midwest. He was brought up in Duluth, Minnesota. His name was Bob Zimmerman, which was odd. He never knew Dylan, whose name was also Bob Zimmerman. They were not the same branch of the Zimmerman family. And he ended up living in Chicago and then in Cincinnati most of the time. So I got to see them. I got closer to him more after my parents died. And he became a sort of a surrogate father. But they're wonderful people. He and his wife died several years ago. But we spent a lot of time with them at Christmas and other times. Well, that's my family. Anything else about them?
Do you have any siblings?
No.
Can you talk a little bit more of your sort of political coming of age? You mentioned that in 1960, when you're at Vassar, you were looking for something to do.
Yeah.
Were there antecedents?
Well, in Fieldston, which was very liberal, I mean, I had an ethics teacher who said that we should take the military budget and put it into medicine and food and drop it over poor countries by parachute. I was very impressed by that. I mean, it was a little crazy, but that kind of thinking was pervasive in the Ethical Culture Society that ran the school, that their Sunday school taught comparative religion. Great idea. And in the high school, there were faculty who had fled the Nazis and so on. They didn't talk about it, that I recall. But it was a very liberal private school, though very privileged. There were a lot of people on scholarship, but they tended to be children of teachers who didn't get paid much or something like that. It was not the working men's school anymore, but still there was that liberal and anti-McCarthy environment. So we had a speaker from the NAACP who said there were a lot of NAACP chapters at campuses, and I thought, oh, this sounds cool. But when I got to Vassar, there wasn't anything, and that's why, I was very happy when we had the demonstration at Woolworth's, and then I met Harlan, and through him I found out about SDS, the early SDS, and started the SDS group at Vassar. And really, Harlan was my political mentor for many years, as well as eventually my husband. But I was pretty active on my own. He didn't get involved with the Great Speckled Bird except socially. And the bird was a huge education. I mean, remember, I was only about 22 when I started teaching. And let's see, because I got into school, we skipped a grade at Hunter. I got into college when I was 16, started college when I was 16, and then met Harlan when I was 17, and I think I must have been 20 when I graduated or something, and 21 when I got my master's degree, or 22, something like that, very young. And so I was still trying to figure things out, and what was going on in the country. Oh, of course, it was a relief when Kennedy got elected, although I wasn't that impressed by his campaign, which was rather conservative. I was starting to get into SDS at the time, and was interested in socialism. I didn't systematically study it at all. Though we had a socialist economics professor at Vassar, I didn't take his class, unfortunately. And then let's see, at Yale, I actually joined a little socialist group that the undergraduates had organized, but all we did was have a conference and invite at Vassar, mostly we invited speakers to come to speak at the campus, which was still all women and a bit isolated from reality, I thought. It's not that way now. But I was busy studying. I made Phi Beta Kappa and, went to Yale and all that. And then moved back to New York, as I mentioned, and things were still percolating. In '63, Harlan was head of the organizing committee for the March on Washington in the Lower East Side, and I got involved in volunteering for that. That was the year before we got married, summer before we got married. So the civil rights movement was really it, and later the peace movement, and the war on poverty, the strange things that happened with the poverty money on the Lower East Side and everywhere else. We got a little involved in local stuff, but I guess, let me think. So really the Great Speckled Bird was a big part of my political education. And things got very intense in the late 60s. If you read Max Ellbaum's Revolution in the Air, though I wasn't in his new communist movement, he does a very good job of describing just how intense and crazy the late 60s were. Something was blowing up or revolting or, something was happening every 5 minutes, it seemed. And it was very difficult to keep up with it. But while I lived on the Lower East Side, of course, that was also interesting. Met Harlan's friends, most of whom were black, and artists and poets and people like that, actors who lived on the Lower East Side, most of them in interracial marriages, some of whom later joined the Black Panthers for a while, till they realized how infiltrated and crazy the Panthers were. But that was after we'd moved to Atlanta. So 66, I'm in Atlanta and teaching at Atlanta University, like I mentioned, for a couple of years, and hanging out with the bird people starting in 68. Volunteered. I had an unusual tolerance for meetings. I went to all the meetings, but I wasn't in the inner circle. I was not an important bird person, ever, I don't think. I was on paid staff for a few months. I think it was in 1969. We rotated jobs. And,
to go against convention,
well,
let me, I want to sort of keep the bird discreet if we can.
Oh, okay,
and I had,
sure.
had a couple other questions before. No, not at all. Before the bird. One is, was there anything that you were reading or listening to or being exposed to in terms of arts and culture in high school and college that was meaningful and might have been leading you?
That's a good question. I was so involved in literature and things like that, anthropology. Well, I had an anthropology teacher who'd been blacklisted for a while. He'd been in the CP. He was an influence, but, sort of indirectly. We didn't talk about politics that much, although I remember him, I remember Lisa Cabot, yes, the Cabot family, very nice woman, who was also in our anthropology and in my classics classes, talking with him and me once informally, and he mentioned that he'd been in the Spanish Civil War. And she said, "Oh, what side were you on?" Well, by then I knew enough to burst out laughing. He was very nice about it. So there were people who, I hung out with who, I'm trying to think, in college, well, starting the SDS chapter and going to New York on weekends and hanging out with Harlan, after the spring of 1960, when I was still 17, 18, 19, 20. Meeting the people at SDS in the office and just kind of, I can't say any particular, it was just kind of the atmosphere that I absorbed. Of course, I was reading The Guardian, not the English one, the left-wing one, and from New York, I guess, and Dissent, and a little bit. The stuff that was coming out of the SDS office was pretty influential. There wasn't any one thing in particular except meeting Harlan. That was the big thing.
How did you encounter or come to know of SDS?
From Harlan. He was actually on SDS staff he was working for Wall Street, actually. He had a degree in economics, and he was switching to sociology. So he got a job with the Wall Street Investment Advisory Service, and in his spare time was volunteering at the SDS office, and eventually spent a summer editing Tom Hayden's first publication, which was a pamphlet called Revolution in Mississippi. It was about the civil rights movement in Macomb, Mississippi, and trying to start a newsletter, which never quite got off the ground because at that point SDS was splitting with the League for Industrial Democracy, and there was a fight over how activist and tied to the civil rights movement they were becoming. Let me see. So in that summer I was around them. The summer when Port Huron Statement was written, we were actually in Europe. Harlan and I went to Europe for a summer before we were married. Somehow we talked my parents into letting us do that, and that was the summer after I graduated, when they wanted to send me to Europe, which was sort of a traditional thing, I guess you did in their circles. Went to the International Union of Socialist Youth Conference in Denmark, found out how corrupt, well, not corrupt exactly, how compromised their politics were. It was all the social democratic parties of Europe, and some third world countries. And we were told if we carried peace signs in the march that they traditionally had through the city to celebrate the youth conference, we would be arrested. We wanted to carry anti-nuclear war signs and things like that, disarmament signs. Us and a few other oddballs from certain parties, youth groups. And they were trying to kick out the Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund for being Marxist, which is one of the German youth groups we got tight with. I think I'm wandering around a lot now.
No.
We get back to the question
you're
asking. These are some of the experiences I had in the early 60s. 64.
Tell me a bit about Harlan, his background.
Orangeburg, South Carolina, first person to go to college, blue-collar family. Learned pretty early that what they were teaching him in church didn't make sense, given that black people weren't allowed in the church. He delivered newspapers. His grandmother ran that part of the newspaper, the delivery part, and got to know a few black people that way, and began to realize something wasn't right. Then he was sort of bribed into going to a military school by his grandfather, and went to Clemson, which at that time was a military college. It's co-ed now, and not a military college. So he said he'd stay for 2 years in order to get $100 from his grandfather, which was worth a lot at that time. He's a lot older than me. That was the 40s, I guess. He was born in 33. And so he managed to get out of take all the courses for 2 years at Clemson in a year and a half and get the hell out of there. It was horrible. And they beat up freshmen and harassed them and did all sorts of things. So he managed, his teacher, he was in forestry, and his teacher got him a scholarship. No, he didn't get him a scholarship, got him admitted to Ann Arbor, Michigan, University of Michigan. And he got into a cooperative dormitory and got to know some people at Michigan, professors and other people who were being harassed by the McCarthy people and blacklisted from teaching. And I don't think Al Haber and Tom Hayden were there yet, but the first thing Harlan did, of course, was participate in a peace march after he got out of military school. He hated military school, as who wouldn't? Well, some people don't. And he was definitely going left-wing pretty fast in reaction to the Jim Crow South and the militaristic culture that he'd been brought up in. Did actually go in the Forest Service for a little while before he got drafted. They drafted him as soon as they could because of his having gone north. His draft board in Orangeburg. He found out that the Forest Service was cooperating with giving away forest resources. This was under Eisenhower. I get them mixed up. So he got kind of disillusioned with that. I think he'd been influenced by Jack London and various writers that had romanticized, the forest, I suppose, and he wanted to. He was sort of something of an environmentalist, I guess, but he found out that the corporations were grabbing a lot of natural resources. So we got sent to Germany, and then after that was able to go to Sweden to graduate school for a year. He only stayed a year because the weather, it just got him down. He and his first wife, who was of Swedish origin and from a socialist family, that's why they went to Sweden. I mean, she wasn't Swedish, she grew up here, but that was her background. And she probably helped radicalize him. So they stayed in Sweden for a year and then took off and traveled around, and he went back to the States to the New School for Social Research, which at that time was sort of a left-wing graduate school. It had a lot of people who'd fled the Nazis and found a haven there. So that's why he ended up on the Lower East Side about the time right after he and his wife separated. He was still at the New School, switching to sociology in the socialist movement, what there was of it, trying to find a political home. And then we met, and when I was in my freshman year, in my freshman spring at Vassar.
And so it's through his program at the New School in sociology that he decides to come south to do field research.
To do his dissertation, which he never finished, unfortunately. But he did publish part of it as an article in a magazine, a popular sociology magazine called, I think it was called Society or something like that. And he identified himself as having been on the staff of SDS. And that's probably why COINTELPRO targeted him for blacklisting. And he was already teaching at Atlanta University. He decided to stay after he did the interviews and got a sociology teaching job at Atlanta University. I think I had dropped out by that time, and was quite popular and did very well until the president got a call from the FBI, which we didn't find out about till a year later. And they, he was in his second year at Atlanta University. There was an agreement with the dean that he would teach half-time, finish his dissertation so he could get his PhD and stay on. They wanted him to stay on, and get half salary. Well, as you probably know, now they call it adjunct. Well, when you're a part-time teacher, you don't get half salary for teaching half-time. You get about a third. And so the president used that as an excuse to cut his salary without telling him. But he found out when he got his paycheck and got really mad. And the president said, well, you can't be treated differently from the other part-time teachers. Okay. So he quit after a while, but after the end of the semester. And we found out why that happened. A year later, the dean, he was a really nice guy and a friend of mine too, when I went in to ask if I could have some summer school teaching, which I had done when I was still on faculty, full-time faculty, he said, no, but we don't have anything, but I found out what happened to Harlan. The dean, the president, who was an interim president, he was the first one to come from the teaching ranks rather than be a minister or a white philanthropist to be president of Atlanta University. He was in a tenuous position. In fact, this faculty had to have a little rebellion to say that they wanted him to be kept on as president, full president. I was involved in that. That was while I was still teaching. He got this phone call from the FBI, and they told him to get rid of Harlan Joye, that he was, I don't know what they said he'd been involved in, that he'd been on staff of SDS, which of course he himself had published, for everybody knew it. It wasn't a secret. But the president's response was to get rid of him. So we found out about COINTELPRO because people started telling us they'd been contacted by the FBI in other contexts, car rental service, relative. And he was applying for other teaching jobs, and somebody who was a secretary at the sociology department at, I think it was Kennesaw, told a mutual friend, she didn't know who he was, told a mutual friend that some guy named Harlan Joye was not being considered because the FBI had sent a file to the sociology department. And he was hired at Georgia State to teach some part-time courses, but then the last day of registration they told him, they didn't have enough classes in beginning sociology for him to teach. He was supposed to teach 3, and all 3 were supposedly canceled, which is highly unlikely. So the FBI had probably gotten to them too. So he thought he was blacklisted for life, and it was very depressing. And he started studying electronics, so he figured he could, fix hi-fi equipment or something on his own. And around that time, we got involved in starting WRFG after about a year of this him being sort of in limbo. And he became the first manager of WRFG. That's another long story, which I can get to. So Harlan was blacklisted, and it wasn't until later under the Carter administration that a friend, Courtney Sisseloff, who died recently, who got a job at HEW under Carter as head of their civil rights, southeastern branch of their civil rights department, encouraged Harlan to apply for a job in it under him. And Harlan said, well, I don't know. But he said, just apply. Let's see what happens. And sure enough, he was hired by the feds to work under Courtney in the Civil Rights Department. And he passed an FBI clearance. Obviously, Carter had cleaned that out. One great thing Carter did. And Harlan stayed for about a year or so and then quit in order to do his Living Atlanta oral history series with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. That was what he wanted to do, and that really has become his legacy, though he had a good job with the feds. Mostly enforcing Title IX, oddly enough, women's athletics and stuff like that, Not really doing the kind of civil rights work that he probably anticipated, race relations, but that was okay. So that was very interesting. He sent away for his file under Freedom of Information. It was all redacted. All of it was redacted. Couldn't tell anything. But, white space all over, white out, except for one part. After SDS imploded into the Maoist craziness, we joined started a group in Atlanta with other people from the Bird and elsewhere called the Movement for a Democratic Society, which was an attempt at a non-Maoist, non-Leninist, more like the old SDS kind of group. And that lasted about a year. We couldn't keep it together, didn't really have a coherent program, which is why the Maoists had been able to take over SDS. But while we were in it, we met once a week, and there was a report on those meetings in the file. We thought everybody in the group were close friends of ours. I don't have any idea who this person was, but the one thing he said that stood out was something that's very shameful. He said, Mr. and Mrs. Joye seem to have a moderating influence on the group. That's not what you want in your history from the 60s. It's not very glamorous. It's not very exciting. I don't know what he meant by that, but we were doing things like protesting the increase in bus fares and, trying to organize working class people and so forth.
In what year would that have been?
That would have been in 69, I think.
Okay.
68, 69, I don't know. The SDS had the last horrible convention that I went to in Chicago. Don't confuse it with the Democratic Convention in Chicago. This is the SDS convention in Chicago, where the Maoists were waving red books at each other and yelling bullshit a lot. And it was all really crazy. I think that must have been 68, before the Weathermen became the staff and went underground. Actually, I voted for the Weathermen because I thought they had more of a sense of humor than the other Maoists. That was the choice, RIM 2 or the Weathermen. And I was wrong. I had no idea was going on? We were in Atlanta, for Christ's sake. We didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going on until later. I read Fan Shen and found out where they got a lot of their jargon from. But the whole thing about the Maoists taking over SDS is an interesting and complicated story, and that's really what Harlan wrote about in that chapter about, well, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, he wrote about the Southern Student Organizing Committee in that article he published, and then how the Southern Student Organizing Committee was taken over and pretty much destroyed by the Maoists, the people who became the October League, who came. A lot of our friends joined that in Atlanta. I can tell you stories about that, but I don't know if that's where you want to go.
I would love to hear about that.
I'm telling you, the 60s were intense. There was so much stuff going on. Many plot lines.
Mm-hmm.
Many plot lines. Sometimes plots.
I'm also curious, how did Harlan or you guys together choose Atlanta?
That was the central place, excuse me, where he could branch out, travel around, do interviews for his dissertation. And it was easy to get jobs in housing compared to Manhattan, really. And I immediately, sight unseen, was offered a job teaching at Atlanta University. I was also offered a job at Georgia Tech, sight unseen. That was because I had this Yale degree and I was at Columbia and I don't know. The Chaucer specialist had died at Atlanta University in the middle of the spring semester, and I was, I had that sort of background academically, and they snapped me up. I had a choice, and I decided, okay, do I want to teach graduate school? That's pretty scary, but maybe I can do it. Black students, teach them English literature, or do I want to teach composition to a bunch of white Southern guys at an engineering school? I thought, yeah, I think I'll go to Atlanta University. I mean, the South was scary to me. I remember the first month I was here, I needed medical attention. I forget for what, something minor. And somebody referred me to a doctor who was at what was then called Georgia Baptist Hospital. That was where his office was. And I was very leery about going there. Baptist? I never had any doctors who weren't Jewish. What is that going to be like? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, my parents were atheists, and it wasn't like we were, well, I mostly knew Jewish people growing up. Harlan isn't Jewish, which was a little bit, took my parents some adjusting. But the riot broke out on Boulevard the day I was supposed to go to the doctor. And I called them up and I said, the hospital's on Boulevard. And I said, I think I'm going to cancel. And they thought that was pretty wimpy of me, but I ended up going to somebody else. I don't know how I found a doctor.
And which riot is this you were?
There was a riot in downtown Atlanta in '66. What was the reason? I forget. Was that when, let's see, when King was killed later, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. I get the dates mixed up. Yeah. And that was the famous riot where who was the mayor, the white mayor?
Ivan Allen?
Ivan Allen, yes, it wasn't Massell yet. Ivan Allen got up on top, went to the riot area and got up on the top of a car and addressed the crowd to try to calm them down. That was considered very brave. It wasn't much of a riot. I mean, I'm from New York, come on. So, but it was a riot.
So that
there was some property damage, yeah.
Okay, so that was probably related to the redevelopment of black neighborhoods.
Yeah, it probably was.
For the stadium,
yes.
or the civic center.
Yes, there was a study done, I think, by some SNCC people, I think, people in the civil rights movement who showed how, that area had been overcrowded because people had been cleared out. Yeah, Larry Keating's book, very good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was my introduction to Atlanta. And then also Lester Maddox was very soon inaugurated as governor. That was my other introduction to Atlanta. And at that time, we had an SDS chapter at Georgia State. And the SDS people and the SOC people organized a demonstration I wasn't in it. There's a photograph of it in illustrating Harlan's article, where they dressed up in suits and they got this coffin, and they put a sign on it saying the New South. And at that time, security wasn't like it is now. And they managed to march right into the outdoor inauguration area and march around solemnly carrying this thing at Maddox's inauguration. That was really cool. People did a lot of cool things back then. I wasn't in the demonstration, but it was nice.
So tell me a bit more about your perceptions of the social and cultural world in Atlanta when you moved
Oy,
here.
gewalt. As we say in New York. We lived on 14th Street to start with, and in a building that burned down. Part of it burned, rather, after we'd been there a few weeks. So we had to move again. It was, it had been a Knights of Columbus hall. It was broken up into little, very cheap apartments, and one of the apartments was later found to have multiple phones and mirrors. I think it was the bar. It had been the bar, and there was somebody running a prostitution ring out of it. But anyhow, it was kind of interesting. So that was right on 14th Street and Peachtree and the northwest corner, I guess. And that building was taken down. So we moved down the street to the basement of a chiropractor's office. Had an apartment there on 14th Street, and it was just a few doors down from where the Bird rented a house. And it was considered a bohemian district. It had one coffee shop and what else? One art gallery. And, it was affordable. But whenever if I walked down the street with a black person, the little old ladies on their porches would stare at me, glare at me, sort of. I mean, it was only 2 years after the integration of downtown restaurants and other facilities. There were no visible signs of segregation anymore in the city, thank God, when we got there in the spring of '66. But, as now, it was a pretty segregated city, more so than now, of course. Not by law, I guess, but when we moved again, when we were looking for apartments, if I told, when people asked where we work, and I would say I teach at Atlanta University, very often that was the end of the conversation. If they knew what Atlanta University was, a lot of people didn't. They might know the name Morehouse or Spelman, but the school was quite isolated from the white city. The students were afraid to come over here to go to the museum or to a play or something, and afraid of being hassled, and my students, graduate students. So it was weird for me, but our social life was entirely embedded in the civil rights movement and what was beginning to be the peace movement, and the sort of oddball movement and artists and so on in the 10th Street area, as it was called. And then it seemed to me, when I visited the campus of Emory, for example, I used the library a lot. You could just walk in and use the stacks, and nobody cared who you were, as long as you didn't steal the books. So I did a lot of research there for my class preparation, which turned out, by the way, was very easy because the students mostly had gone to schools like Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical Institute and stuff. The top students by that time could get scholarships elsewhere. They could go to white schools in the north, or even to Emory, I think, at that point. Maybe schools around other parts of the country, or let's see. Yeah, but the ones who just didn't have the financial means and weren't at the very top of their class tended to go to Atlanta University. And they went to inferior schools that had really no libraries. And they were taught out of textbooks, and they didn't know how to write research papers. So teaching master's students under those circumstances was easy for me, because all I had to do was bring them up to where I was as a senior at Vassar, and they would be way ahead. and I got them to understand that it was okay to express an opinion in a paper, and they caught on real fast. They were smart. I mean, they were good students. I liked them a lot. It wasn't that they were dumb. They were just, disadvantaged. So I was doing fine. But off campus, things were, a little strange. Living in the South, and even though it was Atlanta, and I was living in supposedly the Bohemian district, and had a lot of friends that were cool. Lester Maddox, I mentioned. Can you imagine? Though he turned out not to be as bad as we expected. It's kind of, especially after his son got busted for dope and he started releasing prisoners and going into prison reform. But he did a few good things like that, and actually appointed a lot of black people to positions that they hadn't held before in the state government because of, I guess, all the criticism of him and so forth. He was in the spotlight. So let's see. Okay, so I'm sorry, I started to say, when I visited Emory, I wandered to go to the library and so on. The appearance, just the physical appearance of the students was like I had gone back to the 50s. I mean, the culture of student life and people in my age is in the 20s, was different from the Lower East Side of New York, which had already become hippified, kind of. It was beginning to be kind of, it had gone from beat to hip, and there were head shops and so on when I left. And, it was very daring. I knew some people in SDS white women who dated black guys, that was very daring, stuff like that. So after about a year, it all changed. People started smoking marijuana. That had a lot to do with the music changed. I used to play Dylan's song "Everybody Must Get Stoned" on the jukebox at this diner near our house, just to freak people out. But they probably didn't even listen. But and a year later, this cultural change happened. Before. And it kind of went hand in hand with, I guess, some political awareness. The people who started the Great Speckled Bird were more into the civil rights movement, the peace movement, the labor movement even, in some cases, like Jean Guerrero. And that came a little later. But it was a rapid change in the late 60s. It was very interesting to watch and encouraging, I must say.
Were a lot of the friends that you were making in Atlanta, were they Southerners? Yeah, because Harlan was, they were from the Southern Student Organizing Committee, white Southerners and people, Emory students, Georgia State students. There were already a lot of people from other places living in Atlanta and going to school there, but not as much as a little bit later in the 70s, I think, in 80s. And some of them, the ones Harlan interviewed, had to fight with their families or were rejected by their families because of their politics, their sympathy for civil rights, their activism in civil rights. It was very interesting. Some were not rejected but came from liberal Southern backgrounds. One of our close friends was working for a union at the time we met him, but he'd been one of the activists in the what was called the Southern Project, Sam Shira, and there was a group of Southerners, a small group of Southerners who were trying to organize white Southerners, and their parents were ministers in the Methodist Church, which had a group of liberals in it in the South who struggled, a lot, and generally had very poor assignments to churches, undesirable assignments to churches, and traveled around a lot. So some people came out of that background. I mean, it was quite varied, very interesting. And I'd married into a blue-collar Southern family from goddamn Orangeburg, and they were living in Charlotte at the time, by that time, though. So I already had some instruction in not stereotyping people. In some ways they were stereotyped, but not entirely. And
not thinking of, not calling people rednecks and stuff unless I was really angry at them or had some reason to. So, I just learned a lot about white Southerners through Harlan. Of course, he was considered the black sheep of the family, as he was. And they were just relieved by that time that I was white. They perceived me as white. Of course, he had grown up with anti-Semitism, as my second husband did also, later on. But both of those families stopped worrying about Jews. That was the least of their problems. And started worrying more about whether their sons would marry black people, and were relieved when it was just me. And I look white, though his mother, Harlan's mother, called him up after she met me. We went down one Christmas and met them. And a few weeks later, he's talking to her on the phone and goes, "What?" And I said later, "What was that all about?" And he said, "She asked me whether your parents are darker than you are." They knew Jews. There were Jews who, ran the shops or whatever in town, in Orangeburg. There were a few Jews. And, but the image that's imprinted in the brain is not consistent with the day-to-day reality one encounters. So if that's triggered, if the brain image is triggered, there's this dissonance, and you start saying, "Wait a minute, she's Jewish. She didn't look Jewish, but then how did Jews look?" I mean, so I began to understand the mentality a little bit, though I never felt really comfortable with it. So yeah, there were Southerners, but they were Southerners that were on our wavelength because they were in these radical movements that were burgeoning. And some were full-time organizers. And, and of course I met a lot of black people, but I'm sort of used to meeting black people.
Mm-hmm.
So what else about Atlanta in those days? Oh, by the way, the lease on the chiropractor's basement apartment, when our lease ran out, he didn't want to renew it, and I think it's because we had black people visiting us. That's my belief. Mm-hmm. So we found another place that was not like that. A nice house over in Ponce Highland that was across the street from where our friend Sam Shira lived. Same landlord. He was very nice.
What street was that on?
Bonaventure, right off North.
Mm-hmm.
It's been torn down since.
As have so many things.
Yeah, for the highway that never got built.
So tell me some about how you came to fall in with the folks that started the Bird, and the beginning of that.
Yeah, I don't remember how I found out about the first meeting, but as I mentioned, the people who started the Bird were also around the Southern Student Organizing Committee, and I'm sure it was one of those people that told me about it. So I remember meeting at somebody's house, one of the early meetings when we were trying to decide what to call the thing, and the folk singer Ernie Morris wanted to call it the 3-penny Press and charge 3 cents or something like that. I mean, I remember these discussions, and I was still teaching. I didn't spend a lot of time in the early organizing phase, but when I dropped out of teaching, the first thing I did was, it was if I remember correctly, it was what month did the first issue come out? The first issue had just come out.
March 68,
March, okay. Yeah, I was still teaching. I was just winding up the semester, I think. And so walked down the street to the birdhouse, and the first person I meet is Nan Uruk, who was married to Jean Guerrero. And she was a secretary at the ACLU at the time, if I remember correctly. But she also was manning the front desk at the birdhouse and selling the paper, and I started going to meetings, and I started writing a little bit. I was writing at the beginning. I was writing mostly book reviews and some music reviews, folk music and things like that. Kind of the entertainment side of the paper at the beginning. And at that time, Howard Romaine and Tom Coffin and Jean and were the editors, if I remember correctly, and a couple of them were still working with the Domestic Peace Corps, and had managed to somehow rip off the Domestic Peace Corps so that they had. I forget how they raised the money, but they managed to somehow siphon off funds from something else and put it into the Bird. Somehow managed to do that instead of whatever they were supposed to be doing. I think they were still working for the Domestic Peace Corps. You probably shouldn't quote me. Well, I'll be quoted, of course. I'm sure that they can straighten out the story on that. But I know that was why some of them were in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And so they morphed into starting the Bird. And I just loved it, and the people and what we were doing. And later on, there was some changes in my role, but I was basically a volunteer at the beginning. And I sold the paper too. I dropped out of teaching, so I had no income basically. And I went down to Underground Atlanta, which I think opened around that time, and sold the paper on the street and stuff.
So you became involved right after the first issue, mm-hmm. or before?
After.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't believe I had any role in putting the first issue together. I remember it quite well, though. A diatribe against, what's his name? The liberal guy from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Ralph McGill.
Ralph McGill, yeah, yeah. It was used that British film, What's Up, Ralphie, or something like that, you know. Well, he had done some bad things. He had red-baited a guy named Don West, who was teaching at Oglethorpe for a while, who'd been a communist organizer, and a poet, was teaching, and he got him fired from teaching. And he was saying that SNCC was getting money from I forget who, whether it was China or Russia or the Viet Cong, I don't remember. But I mean, not to put down the good things he did with the civil, he supported civil rights and so on. But there were some dark sides to him, and that's why they were criticizing him. So Atlanta was a mixed bag in those days. Even the liberals, were kind of iffy sometimes.
Mm. So clearly you had experience writing, since that was your background in graduate and training as an undergraduate and graduate. Did you have any other experience that you could bring?
No, and I don't think I wrote for. I really learned how to write for ordinary people at the Bird, because I was writing for my teachers, basically academic stuff, and Lord, I sympathize with them, because when I started teaching, I realized if a student displayed even a spark of creativity and originality, you tended to overlook the sloppy writing sometimes if you were not conscientious. And I think that's what people did with me at Yale. But I don't know, and Vassar, but any other thing? No, other skills I brought? No, just being a little crazy, Like all of us. I mean, none of us had any background. I remember Stephanie being trained in layout by a guy who actually did have an art background, a commercial art background. He was, I forget his name, and then she trained the rest of us. So I also did layout. Yeah, that was a lot of fun, because you were basically given a spread of 2 pages, press type, and you're cutting out, words and pieces of articles, and you're sticking them in, and the photographs, you sort of indicated the space, and you're doing clip art, you're looking through magazines and stuff for funny little illustrations and certain cartoons that were sent to us, and then you stuck them on, and you could put the headline in a spiral if you wanted. It was really anarchic almost. Stephanie kind of kept us in line to some degree, but somehow it all worked together. I don't know how. It's not the way young people lay things out now. If you look at Jacobin magazine, for example, the hip left-wing journal, it's not like that. It's very slick, and all the fonts are the same, We just picked out crazy fonts, whatever we felt would be fun, you know, to go with the article. So that was interesting. I had no background in that whatsoever. Though I had some drawing classes at the Art Students League in the summer in Woodstock where my parents had a house, but that was about it.
Where was my thought going? Had you read any other underground newspapers or other periodicals at the time?
Well, in '66, the Village Voice, yeah. East Village Other, I think, was available. There were alternative newspapers in New York, yeah. So I was familiar with that. So I knew kind of what we were trying to do. In fact, I was a subscriber to the Voice, the Village Voice, until, God, for a long time, till they finally sold to some people I didn't approve of, and got very commercial.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of it as my hometown newspaper. Yeah. And The Guardian, I was reading The Guardian, They didn't have In These Times yet, no, not for a while. I think that was I.F. Stone's Weekly. The concept of alternative media was familiar to me. But what started the Bird and the other papers was offset printing. There was a technological change that made it cheap and easy to throw these things together on your kitchen table, and you go find somebody to print it. So on newsprint maybe, and that was what really made a big difference. So we were at the beginning of that.
Tell me about the meetings.
Well, everybody tells me that the real decisions were made outside the meetings. And I suppose that's probably true. But an awful lot of things were discussed. Articles would be submitted, we'd try to look at them before the meeting. There would be political questions all the time raised about, what was important, what we should be writing about. There were very different groups of people, especially in the early days, involved with the newspaper. There were people who felt that the changes in music and recreational drugs were the revolution, as they put it, especially the music. And so culture, the hippie culture, was very, very important. First, in attracting readers and informing the content of much of the paper. Other people came from a more traditionally political background, from the civil rights movement, not exactly traditional, but their idea was not to be weird, but to try to relate to people, perhaps of a different background, working class people, black people if you were white, Southern people if you weren't Southerner. And they were sometimes disturbed by some of the content in the paper, particularly the language, not too much, but occasionally there were arguments about whether to put fuck on the cover, things like that. And they were a little suspicious of some of the hippies not being political enough and not being aware enough of the war in Vietnam as time wore on and so forth. But generally speaking, and some people had even a background in labor. The people who came out of the Southern Student Organizing Committee were much more politically aware than some of the other people. The people who came out of SNCC. But actually, the cultural and political just blended a great deal. There was a great deal of overlap. So that some of the more political people got busted for grass, in their house at one point, I remember. And the hippies got involved in the peace movement and became aware that the police were not their friends. Well, they knew that from the beginning, but there was once a march scheduled. Let me think. What happened? There were a number of things that happened that brought these groups together. Not just police harassment, although that was a big thing. There was the famous riot in Piedmont Park, police riot in Piedmont Park, because somebody pointed out an undercover policeman who was pointing out to the other cops who to bust in a crowd that was at a free concert, outdoor concert. And then the cops started busting him, and then people started yelling. And I wasn't there, but from what I gather, other people can give you eyewitness accounts. But next thing we knew, there was tear gas, and people who were just in the park that day were, affected by it, by the gas and so forth. And then the next day, again, Nan Guerrero, because she was from the ACLU, and some other ACLU people started taking affidavits at the birdhouse of what had gone on, how the police had behaved. And there was a big legal case, and that was very interesting. And that must have been pretty early, I'm trying to think, 68, maybe 69. And then another incident I remember, there was a peace march scheduled. By this time, we were well into the Vietnam War, and there was a big peace march scheduled that at that point did draw the hip community. And the garbage workers were on strike, and they were having daily marches downtown. So Harlan and some other people met with the union folks and the march organizers from the peace groups, and there was a secret plot to make sure that at a certain point, the march that was coming down Peachtree against the war, and the strikers that were in the downtown business area would meet. And some people on both sides were kind of nervous about this. They weren't sure it was going to work very well. It worked beautifully. They fell into each other's arms and combined the marches, and the peace people and the strikers continued to march for the rest of the day downtown. There was another time when there was a march against police brutality, and that may have been after that riot in the park, I forget. And the hippies and all them were met with the bird people, and we organized this protest, and it was kind of, and we went down to the police station, or was it down to the jail? I forget. They may have been in the same place. It was way downtown. I forget exactly where. And the spokesperson, for some reason, was a biker named Sullivan. It was one of the hippies. And he was given the petition to present, to protest police harassment. And at the same time, there was protests in the black community. Some policemen had gone public with what happened to black people when they were arrested, that people were being beat up in the police station and so on. And, we managed to kind of combine the two demands. And it wasn't a black march, but I don't think black people marched in it, but at least we presented the black people's demands also as part of it, if I remember correctly. I remember there was, it was always, there were always bridges that had to be built between people with different interests and different perceptions, what was going on and what was important. And the bird was always at the center of it, it seemed to me at the time. That was where you went, to find out what was going on, or to ask what, if something could be organized, and that sort of thing. Not the only place, but it was always one of the places at the center, which was one reason why it was so exciting to hang around there. That's why I kept hanging around there. And then finally, I got on paid staff one year for a few months and was circulation manager, which was very interesting because I got all this correspondence, letters coming in from kids in the boonies talking about how they got harassed for bringing a copies of the Bird to school, and people actually got expelled sometimes or suspended in Atlanta too. And it was banned from some schools in Atlanta. You probably know about that. So, but mostly, I was doing the work of seeing that the mailing got organized correctly and put on the truck, and then I'd go out on the truck and help put it in boxes in certain stores and places like that. So we took turns doing the different jobs, which is a pretty crazy idea, but somehow it worked. I mean, one day, one 3-month period, you'd be circulation manager. The next 3-month period, you'd be editor, copy editor, or something like that, and or bookkeeper, or whatever. You'd have to learn that job, and I just did one stint, one shift. That was done because of a concept of anti-hierarchical democracy. It wasn't called anarchism. We weren't anarchists. We were socialists, actually. Or I think we were socialists. Most of us would probably have said we were socialists, on the political side of the paper, at least. And maybe some of... I never really knew what an anarchist was at that time. I later found out. Worked for a while with the Independent Media Center in year 2000 for a few years after 2000, but that's another story. They were a lot easier to work with than the Maoists, I must say. But anyhow.
Do you recall how much you were paid while you were?
35. Was it 35? 35, or maybe it was 50. I don't even remember if it was a week or a month. It was a little bit. In those days, things didn't cost as much, and a lot of us were still either driving not me, but some people were still driving a car their parents had given them at graduation, or I still had clothes from high school. It just, rents were low. Some people were living in group home, communes. Food was cheap. Not that we were well off, but you could go sell the paper after hours and pick up a little more change. And I had savings. It wasn't a problem. And I think maybe that might have been while Harlan was still teaching. I'm not sure. So we had some income.
And on the aspect of rotating jobs and being anti-hierarchical, what was the decision-making process like in editorial
That's a
meeting?
good question. I have no idea. I mean, we would vote at meetings, but like I said, I think it is true that a lot of decisions were made offline. See, that changed later. Things got a little more democratic. I'm sorry. Maybe I better stop and just try to clear my sinuses. It's bugging me. It probably doesn't make a good video.
Okay.
How were decisions made? I bet you get different answers from different people. I was under the impression most of the time that a lot of decisions were made at the meetings. Consensus, though we didn't have the formal consensus rituals that people use now, which would have driven us crazy, I think. But, we would sort of agree on a lot of stuff, or there would be votes. And I'm sure there were people who decided what articles to consider, and, I don't remember how articles were assigned. In the meetings, of course, people would offer to write on certain things, or they'd say, hey, we really need somebody to go down and cover City Hall this week, or whatever. Somebody would volunteer. I mean, I think it was fairly informal, is my recollection. Now, Tom and Stephanie and Steve and people like that who have much more systematic minds might remember more clearly. But, it all changed with the women's caucus. I'm sure Stephanie mentioned that. But that had a huge impact on me. In '68, the women's movement started penetrating the South, or at least our part of the South. Somebody went to a conference in the North and came back, and people started talking. And I found it all quite mystifying at the very beginning, because I'd always, been fine with being the girlfriend or the wife of Harlan, who had a more prominent role in some organizations. And then I was kind of on my own at the Bird, and I didn't feel left out of much. But it is true that within a very short time, I began to, some scales fell from my eyes, I guess. For example, I think I mentioned that some of our friends on the Lower East Side joined the Black Panthers. So at one point, I said I wanted to write about the Black Panthers. And this was very early, like maybe it was 68 still. There were no Panthers in Atlanta. And somebody pointed out, I think it was Steve Wise, who said, why, there aren't any Panthers in Atlanta. And people sort of weren't sure about it, but finally they said, well, okay, go ahead. So I went home to see my family at Christmas and interviewed our friends and read up some stuff and probably cribbed from some other newspapers and came back and wrote an article about the Black Panthers. It turned out there was a Panther group, but we didn't meet them until the next year. So it was, okay, so it went through the editorial process, which was again like those three guys and their friends. And I don't remember much about that, but for some reason I didn't like some of the edits they wanted to make, probably cuts, or I don't know what it was. So they dispatched Ted Brodick, and he talked to me about the edits, and he said, you know, I think I should tell you this. Some of the guys didn't think that you could write a serious political article. I was still teaching graduate school, okay? So I said, oh, really? And after that, I sort of melted, you know, and I said, well, geez, I mean, I didn't know what to think. I'd never been in that situation before. I'd never been edited. I'd never written for a publication. And I'd never written a serious political article before. I'd been writing book reviews and, you know, music reviews and things like that, which were serious. But, so later on, I started thinking about that. Okay, so I went on to write an article about the Young Lords, and mostly gleaned from secondary sources. And when the uptown Chicago group, the Young Patriots, split, and a group went to New York, and then they were talking about coming to Atlanta. Again, when I was up in New York, Harlan and I sought them out and I interviewed them because, you know, find out who they were. You know, they were coming to Atlanta. They never did come to Atlanta. It turned out they were they were the crazy wing. So it's a good thing they didn't. But, you know, so I wrote about them, and some of these articles have all been anthologized. You know, in a couple of them anyway, and you'll see them in anthologies of the underground press. So they couldn't have been that bad. And I started writing about other stuff, and I wrote an article, well, when we were doing the exhibits for the Bird reunion, I was looking at some old copies of the Bird, and I came across a big article about the second garbage strike, the one where the first garbage strike, the hippies had been scabbing. They were hired to collect garbage from downtown restaurants in their Volkswagen buses, you know. So we found out about that. And the second garbage strike the next year at the Bird, there was a meeting. This is not going to happen again.
In what year?
This was 68, 69. I think the first one may have been 68. I'm not very good at dates. Steve Wise knows dates inside out. But you can look it up. So the second one was just a year later, if I remember correctly. It was under Maynard Jackson. I think they both were under Maynard Jackson. When did he get elected? Oh, God, I'm so bad on this. Anyway, the point is, we supported the strike. People went down and made sandwiches and brought them in to the picket line and joined the picket line, and the word went out on the street, you do not scab. And they didn't. The hippies did not scab on the second one, to my knowledge. And we wrote about the strike a lot. So I'm looking at this article about the strike. Oh, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was lying about the strike. They'd say, strike settled, and it wasn't, you know, things like that. So I'm thinking, gee, this is a good article. I'm reading, gee, this person seems to know a lot about it. And then I see at the end it was by me. I didn't even remember writing it. And of course I knew especially a lot about it Harlan was, I think I mentioned that he and some other people helped bring those two marches together downtown. So he and some, I think Neil Herring and somebody else were, like in communication with AFSCME, the union, which he later went to work for. So I did know a lot about it because, we all knew a lot about it actually, more than most people did. And that was a wonderful thing, being able to, tell the truth about something like that. They got screwed anyway, but, that was Maynard Jackson, unfortunately. There were many good things about Maynard Jackson, but like I said, nothing was, so to speak, black and white. Anyway, the Women's Caucus. So a meeting was held. I think Stephanie must have called it. At that time, although Tom was, Tom had edited a paper at school at Emory that, was a predecessor to the Bird, I guess, had some experience. Howard, Jean, actually none of these people had experience running a newspaper, but they seemed to know what they wanted to do. And they did a good job, but their wives tended to be very hard workers and to do important jobs at the paper, but they weren't editors. Didn't really have any specific position. I guess Stephanie might have been called layout director. I'm not really sure whether she had a title. I don't remember what was on the staff. The staff was really just a lot of names, I think. Staff box on the paper, if I remember correctly. So the wives and other people, other women, like Linda Fibbin, who was doing advertising, and some other people, got together, a meeting of us, the women at the Bird, Pam Gwynn, and started talking about our experience, that we didn't seem to have very much input on the decisions and what went into the paper, and we weren't seen as writers, even if we wrote occasionally, and we're doing a lot of the work, and it just didn't seem like the way it should be. So we made a proposal that instead of having whatever the editor structure was, 2 or 3 editors, there would be editors broken down by subject matter, by beat. And there would be 9 of them. And they would be at least half women, or 5 women, or something like that. I don't really remember whether there was, what the quota was, but that the women would be included as editors. And lo and behold, Stephanie became environmental news editor. I was made student news editor, which meant I got, dispatches from around the country and so on. And I guess put them together. I don't really remember doing a very good job, but I was kind of distracted by my personal life at that point. But I was given editor title, and there were a couple other people that became various editors, together with the men. And then the decisions were made by that group, as well as the big general meeting that anybody could have input into. And it was the first time there was environmental news, as far as I know, in a southeastern newspaper. I don't know what was going on in the rest of the country, but I think Stephanie was a pioneer. I think she was, there may have been the occasional article, but there was a whole beat, for the environment that she created. And I tremendously admire that. She did a very good job. So that's an example of what a difference it made. And we continued to meet. It wasn't all fun and, it wasn't all wonderful. There were tension between married and unmarried and, I don't know, just people with different points of view, of course. But we also eventually formed the core or the seed from which grew the Atlanta Women's Liberation Movement, or at least a good part of it. I think there were some other groups that started at campuses at the same time. And I remember being in a number of consciousness-raising meetings and so on, as we called them. I never ended up in an ongoing group that lasted, but the women's liberation issues became huge and were reflected in the paper. We started with a women's issue before we really had the Women's Caucus, if I remember correctly, or at the very beginning, that was later criticized for being very trivial, and I don't remember too much about it, but then we had other issues that were much more sophisticated and serious and better informed as we became more and more involved in the women's movement. And that was a huge influence on me, of course. And I just saw things a lot differently after that. So that was part of my political education. And at the same time that was going on, SDS was starting to get weirder and weirder, and it started out pretty weird, so that's saying a lot. But, that was when the Maoists from Progressive Labor were throwing their weight around, and other people started deciding, well, maybe they've got the sort of, as the song says, the right string but the wrong yo-yo, and, maybe we could be better Maoists. And I was not aware of that for a long time, but at one point, an organizer, Mike Klonsky, came down and started talking to people in Atlanta in SOC and SDS, and the next thing I knew, half of the people I was friends with had decided to join that, and I don't remember, they started out calling themselves something like the Georgia Communist League or something, and then they became the October League, which is mostly what I knew them at. But before that gelled, there was a meeting of SDS called. Lynn Wells, who was one of the leaders, one of the first converts to Maoism here, and David Simpson, her boyfriend at the time, husband, called a meeting of people who were not in an SDS group, but who were members of SDS, like me and Harlan, to start a citywide group. Hey, that's great. Good idea. There's a group at Georgia State. I think there was a group at Emory. There were SOC groups. And we said, yeah. So we come to the meeting, and I've got to tell you this story.
Mm-hmm.
Lynn says, Lynn was quite something. She dropped out of high school to join the civil rights movement, I think, from a CP family. She was a very good organizer in some ways. Small woman, very cute, and very young. And I don't know how young she was back then, but was pretty young. But she was a leader, and she got up and she said, this chapter of SDS will be organized based on the following 12 principles. The only ones I remember that stuck in my mind were support for the government of Albania, and support for the right of workers to organize along democratic centralist principles. And it kind of went on like that, and with all this Maoist, Leninist jargon. And we're all just sort of sitting there in this little room in Midtown, where somebody, I think Skillman, had started a printing press, and we're going, Lynn, this isn't what SDS is all about. This is not SDS. I've been in SDS since '61. What are you talking about? She says, oh yeah, well, this is what our chapter will be, and if you want to start another SD, there's no rule that says it can't be like this, and if you want to start a group based on a different set of principles, you're perfectly free to do that, which was true. So then we all sort of looked at each other. Said, is she crazy or what? There was something about China, I don't know. And so we sort of, the meeting kind of broke up, and people were talking among themselves. People saying, this is crazy, this is crazy. This isn't, I don't know what this is. This is Stalinism, or I don't know what. Well, before a week was up, about half of the people in the room had joined her group because they were convinced that this was the only way to be serious about making revolutionary change, and it's what seemed to be happening around the world, and it was a coherent program that made sense to them. It didn't make sense to me, which is why I ended up in, I mentioned Movement for a Democratic Society, but I was still a democratic socialist, and I am now, and I always was, since '61, I guess. and or 60, and so some of them disappeared, and into to organize the vanguard of the working class, which it turned out was black people, because they were afraid of white people. I guess, I don't know. We were all kind of afraid of southern white people, of real southern white people, ones that weren't already in our circle. And because we all agreed that it would be a good idea to organize white people like Snick told us to do. But I don't know too many people that went too far with that. Some of them stuck around with the great speckled bird that were falling in the wing of the October League. And there was a period when there was a lot of ideological articles in the paper, people arguing different things, and a lot of stuff was happening. The Venceremus Brigade, the gay movement came up, and a little bit later then the women's movement, and started influencing people too. And there was tension between them and the Maoists at that point, and I think even the Trotskyists started out anti-gay but changed earlier. And the Venceremus Brigade was at one point stopped admitting gay people, and some of the gay people thought, well, maybe that makes sense. And I don't know, it got real weird for a while. And the paper got less, I think the paper got less popular as a result of some of this kind of strange dialogue going on within our articles. I had trouble figuring out really what was going on. When I went to the convention I mentioned, the last big open convention that SDS had, the one in Chicago, I was completely freaked out. I mean, it was the stupidest thing I'd ever seen. I mean, it was, with people literally waving red books at each other in groups, progressive labor, and then it split, and I guess that was probably planned in advance, because lo and behold, there was a church down the street that we could go to. The people that didn't want to be with progressive labor, which at that time still included the people that became October League and all that. And that's where we voted who should be in the national office, and I voted for Bill Ayers and the Weatherman. And there was a brief period where the people who became the October League and those of us who were in the non-Maoist SDS were sort of still kind of together. And we decided to have a peace march in Grant Park and bring some people down from we wanted to have some national SDS people. It was going to be an SDS peace march in a working class area, of course. And we said, well, let's ask somebody from the national office. I mean, they're in the national, who's running the thing, right? So these weathermen came down. I swear to God. There were no weathermen in Atlanta that I knew of. We get to Grant Park, and this woman gets up on a platform and says, they all spoke in these phony Chicago working class accents that they'd picked up. And she says, some people think that women can't fight. I say that's bullshit. And she starts going on about taking up arms. And we go, what have we done, That was the last time we saw any weathermen in Atlanta that I know of. When I say the 60s were crazy and intense, it's hard to overstate that. And I was still trying to figure what the hell was going on. Why were these people doing this, And I think we were just all being driven crazy by the war. It just kept going on and on. I just wrote a poem about it last year, just thinking about the 60s, and the refrain was, everything seemed to be getting better every year except the war kept on and on and on. So all these experiences just kind of blur together in my mind because, I'm going to bird meetings, I'm writing articles about real stuff, and then this other stuff is happening. And the Yippies for a while were there, and somebody tried to throw a rock through a bank building window, and the next thing we know, I'm sitting in the birdhouse, and these people come in and say, "Hey, we just threw a rock in the bank building." And we said, "Get the fuck out of here. We don't want to know about it." It was very weird. So, and then there was the Panthers, that was interesting. So there's some article goes out about the quotes Coretta Scott King. It was something about civil rights. And we get this letter signed Black Panthers of Atlanta saying, if you keep up what you are doing, we will deal with you. Words to that effect. So it doesn't say what happened or why or how they'll deal with us. And we're going, what? I mean, we didn't even know there were Panthers in Atlanta. Oh, except some of us did. A friend of mine, Bobby Ginsberg, who taught at Spelman at the time, had met a guy who was there to speak, and a very friendly guy named Tim Hayes. So she called him up and said, "Tim, what's going on? Really, we don't know what's going on. We don't understand this letter. Can you help us?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I guess we ought to have a meeting." So this meeting is scheduled at my house. In Bobby's room, we were all living together. And a couple of the guys from the Panthers were supposed to come. So Tim shows up. And he says, "Listen, the others all got arrested." There's only 5 of them or something. The others all got arrested. I'm the only one. So I'm here, and I hope I can help you. I'm not exactly sure what this is all about. So we're sitting with this guy. Only one of us had met him before, the one who taught at Spelman. And there's like about 15 of us sitting around in a circle on the floor. And the first thing we do, of course, is introduce each other. Let's get to know each other. Like, say who you are and what your political work is. Never heard such lies in my life. I'm telling you. Well, I organize working class white people. Yeah. So then Tim finally breaks through the tension. It was very tense. We didn't know what he was going to do. He says, "Well, I'm an Aquarius." And then we all sort of laughed. And Tim was a great guy. So it turned out, Tim figured out that at that point, the Panthers were having some kind of a feud with SCLC and Coretta Scott King, and were accusing them of being CIA agents or something like that. There was stuff like that was always going on. And he said, "I think that's what it's all about." And we weren't really going to do anything, We said, "Oh, that's nice." So then, after that, the next thing that happens is Tim calls up and he says, "Listen, I'm in the Huey Newton wing of the Panthers, and those other guys in Atlanta are in the Eldridge Cleaver wing, and there's been this big split and everybody's fighting, and they're threatening me, and I think I need to leave my neighborhood and hide out with you guys." I said, "Okay." So the next thing we know, he's on bird staff, and he's living in our houses. Sort of taking turns. We're putting him up in our houses, and he's getting to know us. And Tim is a wonderful guy. He's still my friend, and on Facebook, and he's living in Philadelphia. And so he was one of the few black people on the bird staff. And of course, he broke with the Panthers at that point, I guess. But no, he did a lot of things with the Panthers that he's written about on his Facebook page that I didn't even know about. They even sent him, I think, to Africa at one point. Anyway, he's a very, very interesting guy. And after he'd been on bird staff for a while, in 70, when was it we hired staff? Maybe 73, before WRFG got on the air. We hired him as one of the first 3 people on the WRFG staff. And he's very critical to the development of the station. He was the one who brought in some other political black people, like Iban Dooley, you probably don't know the name, but anyway, a number of people who made sure that WRFG, unlike the Bird, did not start out as an all-white group and was able to include black leadership right from the beginning. And that makes a huge difference. You can't represent the voice of the Atlanta community and be run by just white people. We knew that at the beginning of WRFG. The Bird was started by a group of people who knew each other, and there had been a split in the SNCC group. Whites were not in SNCC at that point. There was kind of a separation in black and white radicals when the Bird started. So it never attracted much black staff. I can think of at least two, there may have been others, but not very many. And that was one of the problems. Well, we knew it was a problem, but we did our best to cover issues in the black community, like the police brutality issue, the strike, the garbage workers strike, which was basically black, and other things. So, we ran articles about the Panthers after mine and other related developments. So that was a difference between the Bird and the project that later consumed me for about 25 years, the radio station. But we learned, and people from the Bird helped, other than me, also helped start the radio station. So the Bird, even after it folded, spawned many other things. As I mentioned, the women's liberation movement here was very much influenced by the Women's Caucus, the gay movement. One of our, should I name names? One of our staff
Please.
people started out as the rock critic, the rock music critic, Miller Francis. Then, and continued to be for quite a while, and was very much admired. His writing was very much admired, and it was very influential. And then when the gay movement started, he then came out as gay and had a little following. And then when the Maoist movement was in ascendancy, he joined the what's it called? The Revolutionary Union, one of the groups, not the October League, a different one, a crazier one. And they decided that homosexuality was reactionary and decadent, because that's what the Chinese told them, I guess. And so he and a woman who had identified as gay previously married. And they're still married, I think. I don't know how she puts up with it, but anyway, that's another thing. She's a rather nice person. While she was gay identified, she and her friends who lived together, she inherited some money, and she and her friends formed a little collective to decide what to do with her money, because she didn't want to keep it. And I think she was associated with the Duke family or something like that. And she gave a few $1,000s to help start WRFG, which was interesting.
Who is she?
Elizabeth, what's her last name? I cannot remember her last name now. She's married to Miller Francis. So it's odd, these things kind of, but at that time she was supposed to be lesbian. And people sometimes identified themselves for political reasons or experimental reasons, or, a person isn't just one thing or the other, anyway, I think, and necessarily. And people who were able to be something at one point in their lives sometimes made a decision to be something else. I try not to be too judgmental. I was rather dismayed when some of the gay people suddenly decided that was not a good thing to be in the Maoist movement. But I think now, that was a long time ago. All that broke up most of the Maoist groups broke up in the 70s, mid-70s, at least by the 80s. I think the one Elbaum was in lasted longer than a lot of them. But those individuals no longer hold those views, I'm sure. But it was as the folk song goes, wasn't that a time? Wasn't that a wonderful time? It was the 60s and the 70s. So by the way, we tried to start the paper again, in the 80s. Under Reagan, there seemed to be a crying need for it. And we could go into why that didn't work, but I think I hate to say it, we were undercapitalized. It was no longer possible to just put out the paper on your kitchen table, and not have we had one paid staff. And the novelty had worn off. People were, there were other free papers. By this time, we couldn't sell them on the street. The competition from the Gazette first, and then Creative Loafing, who made a lot more money than we did on ads, had made all the papers free distribution, as you know. And so people could get their cultural reviews from the Creative Loafing, or they could even get some investigative reporting from the Gazette or Creative Loafing. By the way, I was the first person who did a calendar of events. There was no way when I was living in Atlanta first, in 66, 67, to find out what was going on in town. The newspaper, if you put an ad for a movie, they'd print it, but that was it. Maybe they ran symphony announcements, I don't know. But I would actually go around to the bulletin boards at campuses, Georgia State, Georgia Tech, Emory, and write down what was on the flyers. And other sources, we'd get bulletins from the Quakers or, different churches, and had interesting things going on. Different organizations would send us stuff, and I would put them together in a calendar. And that was the first time you could go anywhere. I think that's one reason some people took the paper, because you could see where there were interesting movies or concerts or something like that. And then, of course, everybody started doing it. How did I get into that? Competition, yeah. 84, 85. It just didn't work. We didn't have the right person on the paid staff. Possibly, but even with a more energetic and creative person or experienced person, I think we still couldn't have made it. People just didn't flock to us as though we were something special. They could get. We didn't have the internet yet, but it seemed like I don't know, public radio. I don't know what it was. People just didn't seem to have that hunger for forbidden knowledge that would at least drive them to a ratty-looking newspaper that some kids were selling on the street. It just didn't work that way, and which was very disappointing, because God knows in the Reagan period it was needed. But some of us, attempted to bring back the paper. There was also an unfortunate misunderstanding between two groups of people that got involved in it, one of whom had the idea before the Byrd veterans did, and consulted with them, and then the Byrd veterans decided, well, hey, we're the ones who know how to run the Byrd. We ought to start the Byrd up again. And then there was an attempt for the two groups to mesh. And the other group, this was the 80s now, the other group was, I guess they would call themselves anarchists. They weren't in a particular organization, but some of them had anarchist politics, which was immediately a source of suspicion for some of the people from the old Byrd. And I happened to know some of them personally. And I knew that some of them behaved a little oddly, but I knew that was because they were just odd. It wasn't because of their politics, but there got to be a point where the people on the Byrds, from the old Byrd, that kind of were running things, thought that a couple of the others were undermining them, and the people in the so-called anarchist group stereotyped some of the old Byrd people as former Marxist-Leninists who they didn't trust, who were acting in a Stalinist manner or something like that. And that wasn't quite true either. A few of them had been in groups like that, but that's not why they were acting the way they were acting. And there were some black people involved, Iban and a guy named Jabari, who was with public television at the time and was really calling a lot of the shots and kind of throwing his weight around. And the black people black people were more put off by some of the behavior of the so-called anarchists and said, you got to get these crazy people out of here or we're going to have to leave. So that was the last straw, and there was a split and they were expelled. And I feel really bad about that because I knew really that some of the accusations against them were misunderstandings. And I knew that they weren't really trying to undermine what the rest of us were doing, and I didn't really speak up as I should have. It was a very difficult situation, personally, and so the split occurred, and there were some bad feelings, but I'm still very good friends with at least two of the people that were involved. So that's not why the reincarnation of the bird fell apart. I think it was the changes in society, changes in Atlanta, changes in the media. Mm. So then, to get back to the bird, the old bird, the original bird, I stopped being involved so much in the 70s. I think it was around 72, maybe 73, because I became more involved in organizing the radio station. Got involved with the people that originally filed the application and were raising money. And if you go to the Little Five Points Community Center, you'll see in a display case in the hall right outside the radio station's offices the first program guide for WRFG was printed in the Great Speckled Bird. That must have been 74 when it got on the air. I helped put that together. I didn't design it, but I helped get the copy together and so on, some articles. And there was some overlapping of personnel, of course. But the bird kept going with a different, you've probably heard the story about how they thought it was going to close down and some other people stepped in who'd been on the periphery to take it over and keep it going. And they did a great job, I thought. They focused more on local news, investigative reporting, what was going on in Atlanta, not so much the Black Panthers in Oakland kind of story, but not so much some of the more esoteric stuff or ideological stuff. But they were still a left-wing paper. And I liked it a lot. It was just so exciting to go, the day the paper came out, I would go to one of the boxes on the street and pick it up, and it was just, I never knew what was going to be in it, even if I'd been involved, and it was just exciting. It was just different. There was always something that was useful to my mind. Throughout the period, there were always things that I thought were ridiculous, but sometimes certain people that were writing what they thought were poetry or just strange things that, particularly in the early days, that came into the paper. But still, I really miss it. I really, really miss it, even though we have the internet and the equivalent of the bird, in many forms. I can certainly read people who agree with my politics anytime I want. And I can certainly read investigative reporting, though it's getting squeezed out. The print versions, maybe not so much. There's one or two good articles in Creative Loafing. They've always had good editors, even though the rest of the thing is sort of crap. But there's not the community that used to exist in Atlanta anyway, around the bird. As fragmented, as diverse as it was, the hippies, the drug people, the music people, the political people, what black overlap we had, all very diverse, but somehow it was a community. And WRFG is a little bit like that, but So I don't know what to say, except it was a huge influence on my life, my thinking, and also I later had a 28-year career in state government, of all things, doing communications, and my ability to write clearly, and I'm sure was because of my experience on the Bird, and my ability to do, I also did radio interviews and public service announcements because of my experience on at WRFG. I think all my job skills came from being in the radical movement. They're very useful. Still are. Conducting meetings, though that seems crazy, considering what the meetings were like. But what else could I tell you?
I want to go back when you were discussing the formation of the Women's Caucus and the first issue, the women's issue, and you said that some people criticized it as trivial.
I think that was before the caucus, frankly, when we were just beginning to be aware of women's liberation and felt, oh, why don't we have a women's issue? It was more like a novelty with women authors. And I honestly don't remember, I haven't gone back and reread, so I don't remember the content. If I had it in front of me, it might make more sense to say that. But I do remember people later saying, we've got to do better than that.
Mm-hmm.
And
as a critique of the content.
Of that earlier issue, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember whether I wrote anything for it. I probably did. So my memory of as I mentioned earlier, my memory of the articles is a little shaky these days.
And what do you think happened after the caucus formally came together, and how did that impact?
Oh, as I said, people who hadn't written much before blossomed. I think I remember Pam Gwynn writing more. Stephanie assumed even more of a leadership role. It was just more of it was a bloodless coup, of course. I mean, the men caved immediately, is my recollection. Maybe they were tired of having to run it, I don't know. But I think we all got along better, actually, and there was more of a sense of collaborative effort, and people were writing more who hadn't written before. That's about all I can really say.
Mm-hmm.
And really it was also necessary, I think, because as more of us got involved in the women's movement, we really had to be consistent with our principles. And the men said they supported it, so they had to too. I don't remember any men particularly fighting about anything, even Ted. But of course I might not have been around for that. My husband wasn't involved, so but he was fine with it.
You also mentioned earlier that the women's movement had a huge impact and changed you. In what ways?
Well, I think I had some fairly traditional concepts of what I was supposed to be doing as a married person, not so much sexually. I was for open marriage at that time, but just who did the housework and who cooked and so on. And I began, that fell away. And Harlan was never a person who was difficult to deal with on any of these things. It wasn't like we fought or anything, but I think we started doing things a little more equitably, and I just saw myself differently. And I don't know. Of course, I always knew that I was going to be earning a living, that I originally was going to be a PhD and an academic and everything, which is fairly high prestige. And I didn't feel directly discriminated against very much. But I began to see things that I hadn't seen before, and I began to identify more with women in other situations, I'd say. trying to think. There were a lot of questions raised about, I mentioned there were tensions between single and married people to some degree. That was disturbing, but at least it came out.
And what was the tension
It was
centered
aired.
on there?
Jealousies about men and so forth. There was one interesting thing.
Elaborate on that. Like, so it would have been women,
Yeah,
single women.
and married women, yeah, who were in different situations. And although really it was the married women, not so much me, but the ones that were more involved with the paper, who I think led the caucus, led the formation of the caucus, and certainly didn't want the single women to be excluded. They wanted to include them. There was one who had the only one of us who had a journalism degree, Sally Gabb, and she was the only one that the men editors seemed to treat as an equal before we had the women's caucus, because they realized that she was the only one who knew what she was doing, or came in knowing what she was doing. And so they, she was given good assignments and stuff. But, great woman. She died recently. I liked her a lot. So I began to see that dynamic. I mean, I just saw things that I hadn't noticed before. There wasn't anything that dramatic, but in my personal life that I remember. But I learned a lot. I just kept learning a lot. I mean, I say I've always been a democratic socialist. My politics haven't changed, but I've learned a great deal about what they mean, in practice.
And was the sort of coming into its own of gay and lesbian movement and its inclusion in the paper, how did that play out?
People identifying themselves as gay and lesbian, and some new people coming in with that identity and having, getting articles into the paper and coverage of the movement. That's pretty much what it was. Now, a friend of mine, Burl Boykin, who I don't know if you'll get a chance to interview, has a whole other story, but he sold ads. This was more in the last 3 years when I wasn't involved directly. And he says that there was some fight between them and the Maoists, and they got the Maoists out or something like that. I don't remember hearing about that, but he was one of the gay staffers. And I think I don't recall it as a particularly difficult transition. I mean, we'd sort of been aware that Miller and the woman he was married at the time were bisexual. Nobody really cared. I mean, the whole hippie thing was very androgynous. The whole culture was pretty accepting. So when the gay movement began to become institutionalize itself, organize itself, that was pretty easy to accept. I believe, now the people who were gay and lesbian may not think so. I don't know what they think, but that was my perception. I had no problem with it. I thought it was great. And I'm trying to think, in fact, my negative feelings were more towards the people that dropped their gay and lesbian identity because of this ideological wave that they were going through. I thought that was kind of slimy. But anyway, but maybe they were just reverting to who they really felt they were deep down. I don't know what they were doing. It kind of, we all were going through so many changes. There was a period when smash monogamy was a big deal, and then people were kind of reacting against that and supporting families, and maybe people were having children. I don't know what the deal was. And people who weren't in traditional marriages were sort of looked askance upon. And then, I don't know, it all sort of, I think some of these conflicts kind of went away, I guess, as the 70s wore on, and maybe other issues became more important. I don't know. I'm trying to remember. But there didn't seem to be as much. It's not that people don't get mad at each other for reasons of identity, different identities and backgrounds now, but I remember them being particularly intense as the movements emerged, in late 60s, early 70s. It was always, there were always disturbing things that you had to learn about and realize that you should have understood them a lot earlier. And class didn't come up as much, interestingly. I'm not sure why. Because there were certainly class differences among people, their backgrounds and what they were doing with their lives. I remember at one point somebody putting down Harlan for being a college professor when actually he was from a blue-collar background, and the person saying it wasn't, was, I think, from a professional background, family, but, there were strange things that went on.
So if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like a lot of these disagreements, the disagreements that you remember on the Bird largely center on a political, cultural split. Is that accurate?
That was certainly accurate at the beginning. Yeah, definitely. And not a split, but a difference of where people were coming from. Like I said, it meshed a lot. I mean, we were all for sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and were identified as hippies, basically, on the Bird by the outside world. Although some people were very serious, had very serious backgrounds in civil rights, labor, were working for the ACLU, like Jean, several people, and there were projects that spun off, like there was a project, Roger Friedman and Neil Herring and some other people started a project to challenge the electric company, the Georgia Power Company, on how it charged rates and things like that. And I think the nuclear issue was just starting. I don't remember if it was an anti-nuclear group. But I learned, what was it called? The Georgia Power Project, it was called. Yeah, they published a book, a pamphlet. And, there were people engaging in very serious issues who also would be judged by the rest of Atlanta as a hippie, or a weirdo or something like that. And we kind of embraced that identity also at times. And so the center of our community was what was called the Strip, along 10th and 14th for a long time, and which was really kind of boring compared to New York, but it was all we had.
Also, to follow up, when you talk about the formation of the October League and that meeting,
yeah,
how many people would you say split off? And
I'd have to try counting them. I don't know. I mean, it was a meeting of about, I'm trying to think, 15, 20 people, maybe. I had the impression half, but it could have been just half a dozen. I don't know, but people I wouldn't have expected to go that way, and who didn't seem to want to go that way until a week later or 2 weeks later or something. Something convinced them. Maybe they had conversations with those people. And like I said, there was a period during which the October League folks and the rest of us were still kind of interacting and even planning things together, like that bizarre march through to Grant Park. It didn't last real long because they tended to go to the other side of town to live, and got jobs tried to get jobs in factories where sometimes their supervisors tried to promote them realizing they were really smart and literate and everything. And actually, Nan Arik, you're interviewing Nan Arik. I'll let her speak for herself.
Which side of town did they move to?
The area around, what are those streets? They've all changed their names. University Avenue, I think it's called Capitol Hill.
Okay, so southwest, sort of.
Yeah, but fairly close to downtown.
Capitol View?
Capitol View, maybe that's what it's called. People still live, some people I know from that era still live there. Not too many. And, they're basically in the black community,
Mm-hmm.
which was fine, but social relations with those people kind of ended for a while, for a few years, while they did their thing. Some people went to work at the Fulton Bag and Burlap Company. I think Lynn and Dave did. Some people went to Nabisco, or some people from other groups went to General Motors, or I don't know, various places like that, usually in union jobs. And some of them ended up with pretty good, well, one person, not from the Bird, but somebody I know who retired from General Motors with a pretty good pension, which is why she's able to continue her radical activities in her leisure time, which is more power to her. But these turned out to be somewhat good jobs compared to, working at McDonald's.
Absolutely.
I don't know if anybody did that kind of thing back then. It wasn't that big a deal to work in a service job. I think we kind of still had the old-fashioned lefty image of the factory worker, and there were more factories back then. I remember one person who had a PhD who dropped out of academia, I won't name names, and tried to get a job at a small factory renovating stoves, the Atlanta Stove Work, but they fired him because he couldn't learn the machines fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually a smart guy, but maybe not so handy, Let's see. Have I gotten away from the subject? Tell me the question.
We were just following up a bit on the October League split.
Oh yeah, the October League, Jesus. And some of those people were real good organizers, back, and probably continued to be good organizers, except their message was different and their methods were different. There was a time when they actually got involved in a significant strike, the Mead paper strike, but that's a whole other, I wasn't involved in that, the Mead plant strike. There's been a dissertation and a film about that. You can look it up,
Mm-hmm. And the Bird covered it.
Oh yeah, it was significant. Trying to think. But I just found that, I've maintained a friendship with David Simpson, and we used to kind of kid him when we ran into him about some of the language. They say people are running dogs of capitalism, and say, why don't you call them hound dogs? Then people would know what you're talking about. This is a bad English translation of probably a bad Chinese translation of a German or a Russian translation of German. Who knows where it came from? Running dogs, I never heard that expression. But you'll notice in the film, the Big Chill, I think it is, the person who owns the big house in Beaufort. Did you ever see that film? It's about 60s people later on. He starts a successful sneaker company. He calls it Running Dogs. I laughed at that.
Mm-hmm.
But, people were talking this jargon that they'd picked up from various sources, and that was one characteristic of the October League. I don't know that they talked that way on the shop floor, to their co-workers, because they weren't that stupid, but it was, it was a mystery to me why people would want to be, I thought there was a lot of intellectual bullying going on in those groups, and that really turned me off from certain people. And going to that convention in Chicago, oh my God. They were doing, I remember Lynn Wells doing criticism and self-criticism. Somebody from Progressive Labor accused her of being a traitor to her, a class traitor. I forget why. And she came back after the break and said, I'd like to do a self-criticism. Yes, I am a class traitor because I didn't fight hard enough against the wrong line or something. I mean, she just, and I'm thinking, shit, these people have learned to play games with words that in some situations would be good things. Self-criticism, nothing wrong with that. But you can use it as a weapon, either to intimidate somebody who's forced to humiliate themselves, or to use it yourself in a way that actually hits somebody else. And there were a lot of things like that. And I'm a radical because, I'm a socialist because I don't want to be pushed around without having a say. I don't like bullies. So I was a little sensitive to that. I guess that's why I didn't get sucked into that. I don't know. I can be kind of domineering myself, but that's something I have to watch out. That's what my husband says. He's right. I have to watch out for that.
What do you recall about, you mentioned at some point that sort of the outside of the bird, the public, whatever that might be, thought of the bird people as all hippies, despite
I think so, yeah.
a much more complicated. What do you think or recall of public responses to and perceptions of the paper and its coverage?
Oh, it ranged all the way from these people need to be kept away from our children. Don't let the paper in the school. They should be arrested, in fact, selling it in a public place. That happened a lot. Sometimes on shaky legal grounds, sometimes less shaky. If you were in a private mall or something, they could throw you out. We won all our court cases. The public, elements of the public were, I would say, had a prurient interest. That is, they were men. They were interested in hippie chicks. They were interested in. Once there was a photographer, a very good photographer, did a photo essay, a series of photos of two of the women, beautiful women in the nude, and it wasn't obscene or anything. You could see it in museums, but the cover showed one of these pictures, and then there was some inside. That was by far the best-selling issue. Then other people were probably, a lot depended on age, I think. Of course, young people were intrigued. They were much more likely to understand what it was trying to get at least partly. And some might have just been interested in the cultural stuff, and others might have, people have told me over the years what a lifeline it was to them, to get their bird in the mail in their ex-urban house and, kind of reading it, sneaking it around and not letting their parents see it, and how it was just wonderful to find out that there were people who shared their frustration with society or some aspect of society, that maybe it was the war, maybe it was just the mores of the 50s that hung on here. So, it ranged all the way from applause to condemnation. And the establishment, whatever you want to call them, City Hall and people like that, took it fairly seriously, I think. That is, they read it and took action sometimes accordingly. But they knew that we were getting into some serious issues, I think. And we would sometimes get a little feedback, but other people would know more about that. I suppose the firebombing was the most serious feedback we got. After, Steve Wise, I think, knows a little more about it. Some other people that have researched it, but at the time, we thought it was linked to our exposure of the Micelles as slumlords. A guy who later became a lawyer did some very good investigative reporting, and we all thought it might also have had something to do with criticisms of the police. It was probably one of those, or some combination maybe. And yet I remember, I think I heard that Micelle later helped us get a new birdhouse or something I'm not sure, but to cover his tracks probably. I really don't know who did that, but it obviously was intentional, and I don't think it was an individual. Somebody, for one thing, would have to go into the trouble to find out where we were. It wasn't a prominent Midtown location. It was Westminster, right off the park. And it was too bad. Some stuff was burned, and it was a nice house. But I remember being in the meeting the morning after it happened. We were all sort of shocked. It was quite something. And let's see, the public's reaction. It sold well. It was the biggest selling weekly in Georgia. Maybe there weren't that many weeklies, I don't know. But it had a pretty good circulation throughout the state. And like I said, when I was circulation manager, we were sending stuff out all over the state to individuals. Maybe they'd order 5 copies or whatever, and then some people had individual subscriptions. And it was clearly filling a need. Because, it's like even today, I live right in Little Five Points, and there are still hordes of bored young people from the suburbs, and there's nothing to do there. You can have a nice cup of coffee, or a meal, or you could buy a T-shirt. But artists can't even afford to have studios and galleries there anymore. It's not, you could go to, there are theaters, but for kids, just hanging out, you walk up and down, it's like 4 blocks long, It just shows how bored people are still in this country, even after all the cultural changes that have taken place, the 60s and, this apparently permissive society we have now. People want a sense of purpose, and I think the Bird at least presented some stories about people that were doing stuff, the civil rights movement, the protest movements against this and that, local news about things going on in the city that showed cracks in the facade, I guess. It just didn't happen again in the 80s, unfortunately.
Do you recall when you were circulation manager? Or,
yeah.
You mentioned getting letters.
From kids.
Right, from kids, and talking about the harassment that they might encounter. Did you ever get letters from people or walk in off the street to the birdhouse? To your point of people are bored and there's nothing for them to engage with, of people coming in saying, hey, how do I get involved with this?
Oh, yeah.
Or how do I...
Oh, sure. Now, I wasn't there all the time. Part of the time I was working, I was on paid staff just for a few months. But yeah, people would come in, or they'd want to contribute poetry or something, and I'm trying to think. People would volunteer to help with layout or whatever, if they were artists. I'm trying to think. I wouldn't say a huge number of people, but yeah, they would come around, especially at the beginning, and there were always new people getting involved, but I'm trying to think what... Certainly when we had meetings about a community issue, like what to do about the police riot or something, or whether to have a peace march or whatever, people would come, if they heard about it. I think it was definitely seen as a community center in a way, but mostly if you just walked in, there'd be guys sitting and women sitting at desks, typing. It wasn't that exciting.
Describe the physical environment of some of the birdhouses.
Oh, well, people had their little work areas, and there'd be piles of, newspapers from other cities. That was exciting. You could look at those things we got sent in the mail, records, coffee mugs, T-shirts, and clippings, lots of clippings, and drafts of articles, piles of paper all over the place. I wouldn't say any messier than probably our work office at home is, but there's just a bunch of them together. And then usually there was a meeting space with couches and old furniture and lots of posters on the wall, because record companies would send us stuff all the time. And so there was all sorts of music paraphernalia and posters and things all over throughout the history of it. I don't remember, the last few years they had an office in the little 5 Point building, kind of, what do they call it now, the Point Center building, where there are now doctors' offices and stuff like that. And I don't remember being there more than a couple times, so I don't remember that too well. It was smaller, of course. And let's see, usually it was in a house, but at one point we had what was, I guess, a warehouse on North Avenue. That was when I was in circulation. And it was a little more drab. But, lively. It was colorful with posters and stuff.
Were there people there at all hours of day and night?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't there too late, but I think some people probably worked at night. And the first birdhouse, Tom and Stephanie lived above it and even had a kid while they were there. I think maybe both kids, I'm not sure, at least one. And so, there's kind of a homey atmosphere, at least for me. And, but people would wander in off the streets. There was one crazy person who would come in every week and he'd pay for an ad. Wolf von Stinkenauer. Mm-hmm. Gene Guerrero might have mentioned him. Gene was the editor. And this guy would come in and he would pay money for a quarter page or whatever, and then he would dictate this completely incoherent rant, completely incoherent, and then he would insist on proofreading it to make sure he got it right, and then it would be published in the paper. And I met his son. I forget the real name, but he called himself Wolf von Stinkenauer. But the son was a really nice guy anyway. He had a lot to put up with. Having this crazy father. Totally psychotic. But functioning. I don't know where he got the money. But, so they were all, you never knew who you would run into. And then sometimes, I think fairly well-known people drop by sometimes. I didn't meet them, but I'm trying to think. Of course, we had benefits, so musicians would support us. The Allman Brothers did a free concert in the park. I think they did the first bird benefit that I remember correctly. I think it was in Piedmont Park. I seem to remember that. And I didn't know who they were. It sort of all blends in my mind too with WRFG. Mm-hmm. I think we had an impact on Atlanta. Well, we certainly did when they imitated us. And the Gazette was somebody inherited money, or their wife had money or something, and they offered to buy the bird, and we said no, and so they started the Gazette, which was another tabloid with investigative articles and some good writing in it, actually, some good writers, and the same kind of ads that Creative Loafing has, almost the same kind of ads. I don't think they got the escort services and things like that. But they got, ads for records and stores and so forth. And they published for a while, and then I forget why it closed down. But meanwhile, Creative Loafing started. I think at one point all three were in print. And Creative Loafing started just terribly. I remember they had an ad for a store that sold full-page ad for a store that sold second-hand jeans, and then they had an article about how second-hand jeans were all the rage now. And it was terrible. The woman who started it was awful, but Debbie Eason. But she hired good editors after a while and writers, and they sort of built up to something like what we've got now. So that wouldn't have. Well, other cities were going through the same evolution. So, like in D.C., you had the city paper and so forth. You had other things in every city. So probably, even if the Bird had not existed, there would have been such papers. But, we saw them as kind of imitating us. So they didn't imitate our graphic style, and they didn't imitate most of our politics, though Creative Loafing editors always seemed to be very left liberal and interested in, muckraking, which was good. It has always been good. And I think the Journal Constitution started publishing calendars of events and doing more investigative reporting and things like that, I think. So we definitely had an impact. Mm. I can't say any particular story. I'm trying to think if there were consequences to any particular story. I hope that people understood the labor situation better. I hope that they understood what was going on at City Hall better. I can't think of any specific instance of it. But City Hall subscribed, I think. Mm-hmm. I think the mayor subscribed. Anything else?
Yeah, with all of the activity here, of the seriousness of so much of the work you were doing, what did you do for fun, for relaxation, recuperation?
Did I say sex, drugs, and rock and roll? I think I might have.
Yeah, elaborate.
Oh, must I? No, people went to music a lot, music concerts. It was really a great scene at that time, and some of the stuff was free in the park. People had parties. There were lots of parties. And, there was people who were trying to think. There was, at that time, the Piedmont Park Arts Festival was a real arts festival. And the park was a nice, it's still nice, but, people hung out there. People just, really a lot of socializing just went on in private apartments and houses. Mm-hmm. Quite a bit of it. People didn't have a lot of money that I knew. And, of course, there were demonstrations. Which, in a way, was a form of, was a leisure time activity that was quite entertaining at times, in the sense of expressing pent-up frustrations. Of course, you hoped it would do some good and make some social change, but it was, it took up a lot of time sometimes, organizing and participating in demonstrations, mostly peace after a while. Trying to think what else. Study groups. Some of the more political people had book study clubs. I wasn't in one. They tended to be very Marxist in content, which is okay. I just wasn't in one. And that was something that came out of the 70s. I don't know. Sometimes it was hard to not just engage in leisure activities. 'Cause I mean, there were crowds of people around the Strip area. You know, you could hang out. I mean, hanging out to me is kind of boring, but people would sit on the sidewalk and talk to their friends, and there was people experimented with crafts. People had communes. People experimented with new kinds of cooking. Really, I mean, potlucks. People became. There was some vegetarian experimenting. There was some just. It was a new thing for most of us to try to cook something for a large group, you know. And I mean, that sounds silly, but social events involving food and music and marijuana, of course, that sort of thing, were very, and just hanging out with your friends at their houses was just very much what we did.
And what were your living arrangements through this time?
Well,
you mentioned some of the locations, and at one point you mentioned a roommate or co-houser.
Yeah.
Or...
Harlan and I did have we bought a big house on, well, let me get back to this. Okay, we started out in a fairly traditional couple situation on Bonaventure. Then we and another couple actually decided to try to have a group marriage. It didn't work out very well, as you might imagine. That's not easy. So we moved into a rental on Ponce de Leon, big old house, and they had kids, a couple kids, and we lived there for a while. Then Harlan and I, because we had money, some money, bought for $15,000. When I say some, I mean not a lot. Even back then, that wasn't a lot. A house in Inman Park, and after a while, the other couple moved out with their kids, and we just rented rooms to friends and had it as a sort of a, just a group house where we shared the house. And 1, 2, 3 people, mostly. Yeah, there was a room upstairs that a friend rented, and 2 downstairs. One person had just gotten out of jail for dealing dope, let out by Lester Maddox, I think. Was it that long ago? Anyway, he got out. And let me think. And, that had its ups and downs, as all those arrangements do, but it was interesting enough and pleasant enough. And then finally...
And where was that? In
Inman Park? That's
Street?
right across from what used to be Bass High School on Washita.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a block from Euclid.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning, we had to scrape 12 layers of wallpaper off. It was divided up into 6 apartments by the alcoholic old lady that had just died, and her son sold it to us. And it was awful when we first got it. People had the kitchen in one apartment was a closet that had a shelf with a hot plate in it, and the ceiling was all full of grease, and it was an incredible fire hazard. I mean, you can just imagine. So it was the gentrification process that Inman Park was going through. The people that were living in the house when we bought it, when we looked at it, were very marginal, and I think even maybe we're living there with not paying rent for a little while. So it was a shame to kick them out, but we bought it and gradually, restored some of it. Never really got it looking beautiful like the Inman Park houses are supposed to be, but the person who bought it from us later finished the job. But we put in, new wiring and plumbing, and it was really quite a project. And so eventually, the other people left, went in different directions. One went to D.C., one went to the West Coast. And so Harlan and I broke it up into the top floor and the bottom floor, and we rented out half of it to other people with varying degrees of success. all sorts of stories I could tell you. But anyway, and then finally, I'm trying to think if, yeah, we were still renting out half of it when Harlan and I decided to separate, and it was a very difficult period. And finally, I got a job in Washington, D.C. We hadn't gotten divorced or anything. And Harlan stayed here. And
What year would this be?
82. I stayed in D.C. through 84. And I was working, I had gotten a job here with the Consumers Utility Council that was a law firm, a state of Georgia funded law firm that represented utility consumers in Public Service Commission rate hearings. I had had a job before with Research Atlanta. I had a series of jobs doing stuff that I knew nothing about. I've always had jobs doing stuff I know nothing about, even some of my teaching jobs, because I could, it's easy to pick stuff up if you know how to do research, and mainly because I was a good writer. So I knew a little bit about public policy. So I got a job with this law firm, and most of my job was to translate the lawyer stuff into English, and also to do research on things like consumer rights and regulations, and also to deal with people who had problems and stuff. Oh, and I had a job for a year on the consumer. What really got me into that, I had a job for 1 year with the Consumer Affairs Agency that had just been set up in the wake of Ralph Nader and the wave of interest and that sort of thing. And I was hired because I got the job was classified as public relations. It was really just a hotline, answering the phone and trying to mediate between people who'd gotten themselves into stupid situations and the people that were trying to rip them off. And there were no laws that helped, so it was very frustrating. But anyway, so for a year I did that, but I got that job because I got the top grade in the state on a public relations exam, which was so out of date it didn't even have any questions about television. This was in 81 or something. But anyway, I and some other people were hired to do this counseling of people and mediating over, when they called the office. And I did a little writing. And after a year, I got into this other job. So I was in D.C. for 2 years, and Harlan and I was sort of separated and sort of not, and then he came to D.C. and lived with me for a while, and we got along a lot better, actually, those 2 years. And then he finally decided he wanted the divorce, and he'd fallen in love with somebody else, it turned out, and meanwhile he'd gotten a job in Atlanta, and I was laid off from my job in D.C., and my very generous unemployment benefits ran out. I loved living in D.C. And then I came back, and so it was actually a little after I came back, we got divorced, and I got a job with the state as in the communications office of a agency that's been broken up since then, but it was Health and Human Services, welfare, aging, public health, mental health, and so on. And that was a great job. It kept me sane throughout this whole divorce thing. And I had that for a long time, and just retired in 2006. So from 84 to 2006, I worked for the state of Georgia. And meanwhile, I was on the board of the radio station. Yeah, meanwhile, like 74, the radio station got on the air, and from 74 through, except for the 2 years in Washington, I was heavily involved in WRFG. I was on the board, I was a president of the board, I was treasurer, I was fundraising, I was doing the program guide, used to do a printed program guide. I was on the air for the first 7 years and doing a program, women's literature and music, and freeform music in a 4-hour shift. Then I sort of ran out of steam and dropped that. So WRFG was really my main thing for a long time, but there were lots of problems with it, and all the time. There still are, but not as much. because there's so many diverse groups. That's a whole other oral history project you really, really got to do. WRFG, no kidding. And I think they are doing it, actually. So with the state, I'm writing newsletter articles and editing newsletters and position papers and brochures and even sometimes speeches. I even wrote a bit of a speech for the governor once, a real idiot. And all of our governors except Barnes have been idiots. Even Carter wasn't so hot as a governor. He was okay. He was, but then, but it was a great job. I felt I was really helping people, telling them about benefits they could get, how to stay healthy. I love public health. That's really in line with my politics. And I refused to. I had a really good boss the first 14 years, and I told her when Zell Miller, when Clinton had welfare reform, and then Zell Miller made it even worse, I told my boss, who was my friend, great person, I said, Joyce, I will not write a sentence in a press release or anything that includes both the word welfare and responsibility, personal responsibility. She said, I know. I'll give it to Peter, So she was great. So I got to do public health, and things that I cared about. It was just a wonderful job until the last 2 years when the Republicans took over and put some terrible people in charge. And I finally was able to retire a little bit early. And since then the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America group started. Oh, by the way, in the meantime, in year 2000, Independent Media Center. I'm just saying this to show how the bird influenced my later trajectory. I mentioned the radio station, huge thing, huge for me. And then 2000, something called the Independent Media Center started, which you might have heard of, that was actually a website where people could post stuff. And so I worked with that for a couple of years, and we would go to Fort Benning for the School of the Americas Watch and rent an apartment and have a whole report back from the demonstrations. That was when the demonstrations were at their height. And mostly, not as many people as we wanted contributed, but those of us who were there did a lot of journalism. So I wrote stuff. I covered the G8 protests, part of the G8 protests, when they were in St. Simon's Island, I think it was, or one of those islands. I don't know. I was in Savannah doing the protests, covering the protests there that were in coordination with it. So I kept doing alternative media. It was a group of anarchists that started it, and I learned a lot about them. Like I said, they were sort of easy to deal with, as long as you didn't get too deep into the politics. They had some strange ideas. But anyway, and then that fizzled out, and then, though there may still be such a page on the internet, and I got into doing solidarity work. I got really interested in Latin America, especially Mexico, and was studying Spanish. As soon as my mother, when my mother died, I was able to travel. My mother lived with me for a while. She was quite disabled. And around that time, my second husband and I got together, and he moved in. And then after she died, I was able to travel, and I went to Mexico and studied Spanish a lot.
What year was that?
Mexico and Costa Rica, starting in 91. Because all that stuff had been going on in the 80s in Latin America. And I said to myself, when the Vietnam War was going on, I didn't know enough about it, and I certainly wasn't going to study Vietnamese. And now this crap is going on with Reagan in Central America, and I didn't get to, learn as much as I wanted, but there's no excuse not to know Spanish. I mean, I knew French, and Latin. So I started seriously studying Spanish, and then 98, there was the massacre of 45 people in Acteal, Chiapas, suspected of being Zapatistas. They weren't really, but they were more with the bishop. But anyway, that's another story. So a group formed to protest that at the Mexican consulate and so on. And, I mean, they were massacred by paramilitaries that, the government didn't do anything about it. So a group formed called, ironically called North American Neighborhood Association. some of the Indigo Girls friends were involved, and the Indigo Girls did some behind-the-scenes support work for it. And so I did that for a few years. And then, so I was doing all these things while I was working for the state, though I'd go out on demonstrations and hold my sign up in front of my face. You know, I mean, I was doing media relations. That's the other thing. In addition to writing all this stuff, I would be contacting reporters, especially when we had a press release, and answering reporters' inquiries. There was a lot of that, even being filmed sometimes, answering questions. And so I couldn't do as much demonstrating as I would have liked maybe, but in 2006, when I cut the umbilical cord and retired, got a part-time job for 6 years, but with a very nice nonprofit, the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund, that has a headquarters donated at the Atlanta Zoo, and they needed somebody to do some of the communications work there. Same thing, press releases, newsletters. I knew nothing about gorillas or Africa. You know, always had jobs I knew nothing about. Learned very fast. The people were very nice. Enjoyed that a lot. Learned a lot. Anyhow, so I'm doing a little part-time work, but lo and behold, I'm going to the Nation magazine discussion group, which has since folded, but you know, just trying to find something political to do. They didn't want to do any actions or anything, but we had some discussions. And this guy shows up, Milt Tambor, who had just moved from Detroit to be with his grandchildren, and he had been in Democratic Socialists of America. They have a strong group there. And he wanted to start a DSA group. And there had been one here in the 80s, but I didn't think it was radical enough. I mean, I liked getting fundraising letters from Ed Asner, but, you know, and I knew who Michael Harrington was. But at that time, they were perceived as more, really it was unfair, they were perceived as more of a left, an appendage to the left wing of the Democratic Party than they really were. They were really pretty good. But I didn't pay too much attention. So, but in 2006, I thought, well, you know, this is the Bush era, any port in a storm. So I checked into it, and it was, in fact, what I was looking for. And before I knew it, I was secretary of the group, and I'm like still secretary of the group. I'm still an officer. And in 2007, I was recruited to be on the national board, which is called the National Political Committee. And for 8 years, I just quit a year ago. For 8 years, I went to New York 3 times a year, and I went to the conventions, and I was actually a national officer of Democratic Socialists, and I was on the, but again, doing a lot of what I do, what I've always done, newsletters. I helped edit the newsletter, the magazine they have, the blog, the website. I'm still on those 2 committees, even though I quit the overall board. And sometimes I was helping new groups start, personnel committee, doing all sorts of things, and helping make decisions about stuff, and got to know those people. And they're just wonderful. They have been around, some of them have been around a long time, and they learned how to be radical but not crazy, which is what I was looking for, and democratic and sensible, you know, and got into this Bernie thing, and are growing a lot now. And so, but I'm still doing newsletters and, you know, writing stuff, and never wrote a book or even a short story that got published, but I can't say I'm a creative writer in that respect, but I like doing minor journalism, and I can do it in my sleep. I can write a press release in my sleep, because I did so many of them in my work at the state, and that's, you know, I owe some of that to the bird, I guess. So there you are.
And I know because we were both at the annual potluck this past Saturday, that clearly you are still in touch with some bird folks. Can you talk about your relationships with people from that period?
Well, that's interesting, because I think I said at the beginning I was never an important person. Excuse me. I was never an important person. I was not in the inner circle. in my opinion. And a couple of other people that I was friends with at the time expressed the same thing, that they didn't feel they were in the inner circle.
Who's the inner circle?
Well, while I was there, and remember I left about in the early 70s to do the radio station, so I was there from 68 to 71, 72, I guess. Tom and Stephanie, Gene Guerrero when he was there, before I guess he became full-time with the ACLU, Howard Romaine. You really have to interview Howard Romaine. What a character. Anyway, but smart, good writer. I'm trying to think who else. Steve Wise, when he got there in 70, I think it was, after the first year or two. There were a few other people. I think the Gwynns, who you've got an interview lined up with, Jim Gwynn, I think, or maybe Pam, is on your list. Very nice people. I think he got involved in they got involved in one of those Maoist groups. I remember him saying something like, I'm going to raise my children to participate in production. And I thought, yeah, I'm sorry, but I don't even know if he was in a group. But I mean, people took on this jargon, this vocabulary of the Marxist-Leninists. Drove me nuts. But okay, I mean, I'm a writer, okay. Not that kind of writer.
Mm-hmm.
So, very nice guy. Very nice people. I like them a lot. Nan, of course, though was she on paid staff? She might, I don't think so. I think she always had other jobs, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but then she went off and went to Nabisco and so on. Anyway, you can ask her about that. So, I was very much, I mean, it seemed to me that there was an inner group and then an outer group, sort of like the moons of Pluto or something. And I was somewhat content to be in the outer group. I knew I wasn't going to be there every day and shoulder the heavy load like Stephanie did, for example, and Tom. And sometimes it was a little bit weird, to feel that way, but I kind of accepted it. And at one point, Stephanie was very critical of me, and I think rightly so, for being too distracted by my personal life, problems Harlan and I were having and that I was having with other relationships, to do as much writing as she hoped I would do, which is, a good kind of criticism. And I don't know, she can be kind of bossy, and I don't know if I should go on tape saying these things, but now I like her a lot. I think she's a wonderful person. And I still see her occasionally, for one reason. In fact, I'm going to go to her. She's having a mural, mosaic thing Sunday. And, I ran into Steve at different things. Some of them turned up at the radio station doing stuff. Not too many, actually. At the very beginning, there was one guy who died some time ago. John Jacobs, who hung around a lot. He didn't help out very much, but he was one of the people who wrote a lot and very well, actually, for The Bird in the last few years. Ted Brodick. I don't know if I should talk about people too much. I'm not going to say any more about Ted. But, I run into people we're all in the same political. I don't know anybody that went right-wing, frankly. There's this myth that, you get older, you get conservative. I know a few people in my life that I've known who have done that, but very few, very few. Generally speaking, people they might get discouraged. They might get too distracted by, family issues. Having to bring up kids is a big thing, taking care of elderly parents. But most people I know have found some outlet. Sally Gabb became a literacy teacher and ended up running some programs for community education programs in Rhode Island, I think. Okay, that's not a radical thing, but it was kind of in line with wanting to help people. She's the one with the journalism degree. And other people have done things like that were sort of community service projects or careers. But most of us turn up at all the peace demonstrations, maybe even organize them. The Georgia Peace and Justice Coalition includes some old bird people, I think. Yeah, Bob Goodman and Jim Skillman and the Coffins go out every Wednesday with signs on the corner of Briarcliff and Ponce de Leon. I haven't joined them as much as I should, but I don't go out to a lot of stuff as much as I used to. My knees started going on me, and they're fine now because I did a lot of exercises, but I don't know, I'm just getting old. I just don't go out in the hot sun that much, and I don't go walking as far as I do, if I can help it, as I used to. But we show up at a lot of the same meetings. Oh, Moral Monday, that was another big thing that happened recently. Trying to think if a few bird people, I guess, showed up at that, not too many. Come to all the rallies. We're great rally attenders and demonstration attenders, certainly in peace things. Of course, Nan became an important political figure, and I have always, supported her a little bit with a little bit of money and, what I can do. That's an unusual trajectory. Not all of us were that bold to run for office. Very few, I don't think anybody was, besides her. There may have been some people that tried. Some went into academic careers. Well, of course, Tom did, and then, as a sociologist and then an arborist. And Stephanie, teacher. My friend Tim Hayes, the Black Panther, had to leave town because when his wife got pregnant, he was on parole or something, or probation, which one takes longer, for something. And they told him, look, it's all very well you working for WRFG for this tiny salary, but you have to get a real job. So they went to Philadelphia, where her family is, and she had the kid. And they just had a wonderful life in Philadelphia. She was somebody he met at the Great Speckled Bird. He married a white woman, Italian-American, who I like very much. And they had a baby, got married, had a baby, moved to Philadelphia. That's my ex-Black Panther friend. And they had a rock thrown through their living room window while they were still in Atlanta, living together. I remember. Trying to think. I got back in touch with Tim just a couple years ago on Facebook, but we had seen him at the reunion and had a special dinner for him and some people, and it was just so nice seeing him. But a lot of people would go in different directions, especially the people that went into the October League and things like that. A couple moved to Florida. People moved, different places. So I didn't see that many of them. So it's really nice to have that reunion. I see Bob Goodman at Peace Things. He's still very active. None of them that I remember got involved in the Independent Media Center for some reason. So I met a whole new group of, Walter Reeves, who just contributed a little bit to the paper. He's the one that I said you want to get in touch with because he was a consumer of the paper in high school. He was real young. He is real young. Dozen years younger than me. But he had some articles, I think, and cartoons in the paper. He was in the Independent Media Center thing. But he's the only person I remember. Miller, God knows what. I do not see Miller, if I can help it. Let's see. Ted Brodick, yeah. I'm friends with Ted's wife, now ex-wife, Ann Money, wonderful person, in Grandmothers for Peace and the Peace Movement and all sorts of things. And I think she was on the Bird in the last few years, Ann Money. I don't know if that name came up. I don't know if she was full-time, but I think she was involved. That's about it, really, that I can think of.
And what does, from the standpoint, 40, almost 50 years later now,
Oh yeah, getting the reunion together, of course, was a whole project for a year, and then I was in constant touch with them. That was fun. Even though I was a peripheral sort of person most of the time, I still had such a strong identification with the bird. I really enjoyed the reunion and coming to these potlucks. Anyway, what else were you saying?
from the standpoint of almost 50 years later, what does the bird in that era mean to you now?
Well, as I said, a lot of my political education came there, later in DSA and WRFG too, getting along with people at WRFG. Anyway, but a lot of my political education in the 60s was at the Bird, with all the movements that came through and washed over us and almost drowned us sometimes. Just amazing, from women's liberation and gay liberation to Maoism and learning job skills. But I don't know, it was just unforgettable. I'm so glad that I had an opportunity to be involved and to contribute and to get to know those people. I think that and WRFG, if I'm remembered for anything, it'll be for helping start WRFG probably, although, again, I was not manager or on paid staff or anything, but I helped get it started. And most people won't know me from the Bird, from my connection with the Bird after I'm gone, but I would consider that sort of a legacy. The fact that I had some role in it anyway. And it sort of gave meaning to my life in a way while I was doing other things, like teaching or doing other jobs. Research Atlanta was while I was involved with the Bird. I'm trying to think, because that was sometime in the early 70s. Let's see. Yeah, because I was teaching part-time in the early 70s and doing waitress work for part of the time. Terrible waitress. And then, the Bird stopped in 76, I believe. And like I said, by that time it was the radio station. But of course, the Bird and the radio station were, sister organizations. Mm-hmm. So the Bird, I think, I don't know, it just led me into other things that have been very meaningful to me, even after it folded. I was very sorry when it folded. I couldn't go out on the street once a week and see it in the box anymore and read what all these interesting people had to say. Mm. Creative loafing is not the same thing, though I still read it. And Southern Voice, too. Or The Voice, was that what it was called? I think it's called Southern Voice now. I read the gay paper religiously for a long time, mainly to read Alison Bechdel's comic strip. And it got kind of conservative. But I don't know what it is right now. I haven't read it recently. Mm. But there just isn't the same thing.
No. Well, are there any other closing thoughts? We have thoroughly gone through so many of the themes that I wanted to cover.
Well, I think it's terrific that it's got digitalized finally, and that students are studying it. I mean, I feel sort of like a dinosaur. I told you I've been interviewed for other projects having to do with SDS and WRFG, and I suppose at some point they might even interview me about DSA, I don't know, but other things I've been involved with. But I hope young people today have the courage to do what we did. I mean, they do, obviously. They're on the internet. They're doing Jacobin magazine. There's a million zines or whatever. Maybe that was a decade ago. I'm not sure what they do now. Not print, but all these computerized forms of expression are very good, but on the other hand, it's very hard to share them with people. I mean, they don't see them in a box on the street. They don't see them at a newsstand. You can try to get them, you can send them a link, but sometimes it's just not the same sense of community that we had back then, especially because we were the only game in town, actually, for alternative media. So maybe that was just a privileged position, a historical moment we happened to be in. But I think people just need to continue to find whatever way they can to speak out, against the received wisdom and the there is no alternative mentality. The Bernie campaign was a tremendous breakthrough. Well, so was Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Atlanta. I was a little involved in that. And the Moral Monday movement, which is trying to revive itself. I don't know. But that's a little different sort of thing. But all of these, there has to be movement from below. And the Bird, although you could say it was started by some really people from colleges, it wasn't started by, a guy off the shop floor, though some papers have been. Nevertheless, it was an expression from the unaccepted parts of society, I think, some unaccepted parts of society that were able to push against the ceiling, of accepted wisdom. Mm-hmm. And you just have to keep doing that. Otherwise, we're all going to be, oh, God, I hate to think what might happen if the corporate hegemony continues the way it's been going with Citizens United and gerrymandering and the Republicans could control the entire government if we're not careful. And you look at what the Republicans have become, Oh, well, I could go on forever, but the Democrats aren't so hot either, but at least there's a possibility. So I'd say keep, as I said in the 60s, keep on trucking, but, the Mr. Natural cartoon, Tom at one point had an actual trucking firm, moving firm with another guy with blues called Keep On Trucking. With Mr. Natural on the side of it.
Yeah.
I've always loved cartoons. So it's amazing what sometimes a dissenting voice can do, but it's tough. And you don't get rich, usually.
No. Well, thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing this. I hope it, comes together well and can be. I hope somebody can edit parts of it maybe into a documentary that would be useful, at least as a research. I mean, people aren't going to. I don't think people are going to watch hundreds of hours of this stuff. So if there's some way of condensing it, getting highlights, I think that would be a really wonderful film project, which you'd have to get a grant for, of course. Yeah. So good luck.
Or possibly a student over in the Department of Communication
a project.
Might take this on as a
That's true.
As a project.
That would be great. Yeah.
But I think already just with a handful of interviews completed that there is lots of material that's coming together, and there will be lots of ways for people to engage it.
Well, it'll be very interesting. I'll be interesting if you can, later on, I'm assuming it's over, later on if you...
Well, let me turn it off.
Yeah.